Welcome to this calm journey through places that time forgot to finish. Somewhere in these ruins, a door is still locked from the inside. A bed is still made. A radio is still on. Nobody left. Nobody came back. These lands did not die. They were simply abandoned mid-sentence. Let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from tonight, and subscribe so the next journey finds you now. Before we go any further, a bowl of cereal sat on a kitchen counter in Sanctuary Hills on the morning of October 23rd, 2077. It was half-eaten, spoon still in it. The person who left it there walked out the front door, ran up a hill, and never came back. That cereal is still there. 200 years later, in the ruins of that same kitchen, in that same bowl, in that same position, untouched, petrified, waiting. No one preserved it. No one chose to keep it. It simply remained because nothing came to take it away. That is what Sanctuary Hills is. Not a neighborhood, not a ruin. A record of a morning that never finished. The grass here has grown through the cracks in every sidewalk. Overgrowth has pulled most of the fences down. The houses still stand in their original rows, pale and hollow, their windows dark, and their front doors hanging at tired angles. The air carries the dry weight of old wood and long-settled dust. There is no wind most of the time, only stillness, and the occasional sound of something small moving through what used to be someone's lawn. The detail that defines Sanctuary Hills is the one almost no one saw, the pre-war version of the neighborhood, the version that existed in the opening 4 minutes before the bombs fell. Was built with fully rendered interiors for every house on the block, rooms that served no purpose, furniture arranged in configurations no story required, a neighbor's bathroom with a toothbrush beside the sink, a child's bedroom with a half-made bed. These spaces were constructed to a level of domestic care that most people passed through too quickly to register. The environment team did not need to build those rooms. There was no reason to put that much time into spaces that existed for less than 4 minutes of gameplay. Yet they were built anyway, with the same attention given to locations that mattered. And the cereal, that half-eaten bowl sitting on the counter in the kitchen, was still there when the ruins version of the same house was rendered 2 centuries later, petrified, untouched, sitting exactly where it had been left. It serves no practical purpose in either version, yet its presence quietly reinforces something that no dialogue could explain. The morning ended mid-sentence, and the sentence was never finished. The faded Nuka-Cola sign above the red rocket truck stop catches what little light reaches it through the overcast sky. One of the stranger details connected to that same morning involves the Nuka-Cola bottles scattered throughout the neighborhood. In the pre-war version, they are full, sealed, pressurized, containing the bright red liquid that the Nuka-Cola corporations spent decades marketing across the Commonwealth. In the post-war ruins, those same bottles, or bottles exactly like them, are still found on shelves, in kitchens, in collapsed vending machines, and they weigh exactly the same, 1 pound, whether full or empty, sealed or open, 2 centuries old or freshly produced. Every Nuka-Cola bottle in the Commonwealth carries an identical weight. The records that govern those measurements never accounted for evaporation, for decay, for the slow departure of liquid through a cracked seal over 200 years. An empty glass bottle and a full one were treated as the same object, and that treatment remains encoded in every container found across the wasteland. In Fallout 4, even the physics of survival did not account for time, passing the way time actually passes. Just south of the neighborhood, the red rocket truck stop sits beside the road in its own particular silence. Rust has claimed most of the pumps. The service bay doors are partially open, and the interior smells of old motor oil and concrete dust. Beside the garage entrance, there is a dog bowl. It is positioned near the base of the door frame, low to the ground. The kind of detail that reads at first as decoration. Evidence of a dog that once lived here, presumably gone along with everything else. The bowl was placed during an early stage of construction, before the large shepherd who now waits at this location, was confirmed as a companion the wasteland would offer. The bowl existed before the dog. When the companion was added to this specific location, waiting at this specific truck stop, surviving alone on the edge of the neighborhood for years, no one removed the bowl or added any text to explain it. The result is a story told entirely through placement. The bowl implies years of solitary habitation. It implies a routine. It implies that the animal sitting near the garage has been here long enough to have a designated spot for water. Whether this was a deliberate piece of environmental storytelling or a fortunate accident that was never corrected, the bowl remains, and the dog beside it has been waiting, by all appearances, for someone to come back. The light through the truck stop's cracked overhead panels is pale and even, settling across every surface without casting strong shadows. Inside the service bay, a terminal screen still holds a faint glow. The customer complaint logs stored on that terminal were never marked as important. They do not appear as interactable entries in the standard interface. Reading them requires approaching the screen at a specific angle, close enough that the ambient text becomes legible in full. The complaints are ordinary: billing disputes, scheduling errors, a recurring disagreement about the cost of tire rotation. One name appears across multiple entries: B. Howard. The complaints attributed to this individual span several months and show a consistent pattern of disputing service charges. The name does not appear anywhere else in Sanctuary Hills, in Concord, or in any connected record across the Commonwealth. Whether B. Howard was a reference to the pre-war actor Cooper Howard, whose identity in the Fallout television series connects to Los Angeles and the entertainment industry of the 2070s, was never confirmed by anyone involved in the construction of that terminal. The name was placed, and the question it raises was left open. In the wasteland, even a billing complaint can become a mystery, with no resolution. The Commonwealth is built on a specific kind of historical memory. Sanctuary Hills sits near Concord, Massachusetts, the town where the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired in April of 1775. Earlier records from the capital wasteland, compiled from accounts of the region a decade before the Commonwealth's present, described pre-war Boston as a city with active preservation efforts. Museums, walking tours, maintained landmarks celebrating revolutionary history. When those same sites are found in their ruined form across the Commonwealth, something unexpected remains intact. The Museum of Freedom in Concord still carries its original name above the entrance. The exhibits inside still hold their placards. The language describing those battles from 300 years before the bombs fell survived 2 centuries of nuclear winter, while the people who had maintained it did not. Historical memory proved more durable than the civilization that produced it. The ruins of the Commonwealth suggest that certain things, certain ideas, certain records, certain names on certain walls, outlast almost everything else. Wind moves through the gap between 2 collapsed houses on the block's eastern edge. The ambient sound of Sanctuary Hills in the post-war present was constructed from layered recordings. A low, persistent wind, distant bird calls, the occasional groan of settling timber. Some of those recordings were original, others were not. The bird calls that drift over the ruined neighborhood were taken from an earlier body of work, specifically from the environmental audio constructed for the capital wasteland, the ruined territory surrounding what had once been Washington, D.C. The calls used near the walls of Megaton, a settlement built around an undetonated nuclear device in that earlier wasteland, were reused here. The birds calling over a Massachusetts suburb in 2287 are, in the architecture of recorded sound, the same birds that called over a settlement 1,000 miles south 10 years earlier. No connection between the 2 populations was ever documented in lore. They share the same voice because a recording was made once and was used again. In the wasteland, even sound carries the traces of somewhere else. Up the hill, north of the neighborhood, the concrete entrance to Vault 111, one of the many sealed vaults constructed by the Vault-Tec Corporation across the country, is visible from almost any point in Sanctuary Hills. The vault system was designed to house civilians in the event of nuclear war, though the true purpose of most individual vaults diverged significantly from that stated mission. On the morning the bombs fell, residents of the neighborhood ran toward this entrance. The footage of that morning shows a specific path, across a lawn, up a slope, toward the heavy blast door. What records of the landscape now show is that the hill as it exists in the post-war present does not precisely match the hill as it appeared in the opening moments of that same morning. The elevation shifted, the slope angle changed. The path those residents ran along no longer connects to the vault door at the same point it once did. The landscape was adjusted, quietly, without any record acknowledging the adjustment. And the path those people took became, in the post-war geography, a path that leads to nowhere in particular. The landscape was changed, and the change was left unreconciled with the memory of what happened there. Somewhere inside that vault, sealed in a locker for 2 centuries, a Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV waited. The Pip-Boy, a wrist-mounted personal information device produced by Robco Industries, was issued to residents as standard equipment upon vault entry. The device found inside Vault 111 was stored in a sealed environment, undisturbed, unhandled, in a space where nothing moved and nothing changed for 200 years. Yet the surface of that device, when it was finally removed and worn for the first time, showed scratches, wear marks, the texture of an object that had been handled extensively over a long period of use. The choice to render it this way was made deliberately. The worn appearance was preferred over a clean, factory-new surface. But the implication created by that choice was never addressed in any written record within the vault. A device that was never used looks like it was used for years. The person it was originally assigned to, whoever wore it before it was placed in that locker, left no name, no record, no explanation. Their identity was not preserved. Only the wear they left on the surface remained. What remained of Sanctuary Hills was not a neighborhood but a record. The kind that survives not because anyone preserved it, but because no one came back to erase it. The cereal sat in its bowl. The bowl sat in the kitchen. The kitchen stood in the house, and the house stood in the row, alongside all the others, waiting in the long quiet for a morning that had already ended. The road south from the Red Rocket leads through scattered wreckage, and somewhere ahead, past the broken asphalt and the collapsed fencing, the outline of a building rises against the grey sky. A building that still flies a flag, above walls that still hold, above a town that chose to remember what it was built to protect. The road south from the Red Rocket leads here, to Concord, where the streets still carry the shape of a town that was, on the morning it ended, in the middle of celebrating something. Faded red, white, and blue cloth strips hang from the railings of buildings that have not been maintained in 2 centuries. The museum at the center of town still bears its name above the entrance, carved into stone that nuclear fire could not erase. The air here is heavier than it was on the hill, denser with old brick dust and the particular stillness of enclosed spaces that have not been properly ventilated since before the war. Somewhere above, on the rooftop, the angular silhouette of a power armor frame catches the grey light. The Museum of Freedom was, before October 23rd, 2077, a functioning institution dedicated to American Revolutionary history. Its interior, still largely intact in the present ruins of this territory, holds exhibit plaques describing the battles of Lexington and Concord, the midnight ride of Paul Revere, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Each plaque was written as fully readable text, complete with footnotes citing specific dates and named historical figures. None of this information is marked as important. None of it connects to any objective. It exists entirely for those who choose to stop and read it. who stand in a bullet-scarred hallway and study the footnotes of a museum exhibit, while the sounds of conflict echo through the floors. Above them, the text survived because stone and metal survived. No one chose to preserve the words. The words simply outlasted the people who had written them, and the people who had read them, and the world that had needed them to mean something. Pale light filters through the museum's upper windows, laying long rectangles across the dusty floor. Preserved alongside those exhibit plaques is something smaller and far more specific. On the second floor, past the main areas of conflict and up a staircase that most people climb without pausing, a terminal screen still holds a faint charge. The records stored on it include a volunteer staff schedule from the final week of October 2077. Shift times are listed. Break rotations are noted. A supervisor's message at the bottom of the schedule reminds staff that the gift shop would be closed on Friday, October 17th, for inventory. The gift shop referenced in that message is one floor below. Its shelves still hold unsold merchandise, replica tricorn hats, miniature Liberty Bell keychains, a souvenir snow globe of the Boston skyline. The snow globe is intact. The inventory that closed the shop on October 17th was never finished. 6 days later, there was no longer a reason to finish it. The schedule, the closed shop, and the unstocked shelves together form a record of an institution that was interrupted at a completely ordinary moment, mid-task, with no warning that the task would never be resumed. The gift shop's window looks out onto the street below, where the bunting still hangs from the railings in long, weather-beaten strips. On the rooftop above all of this, a T-45 power armor frame, one of the earliest models produced by West-Tec Research Incorporated under contract with the United States military, stands in a fixed position, its occupant long gone, in records compiled from the Capital Wasteland, a region centered on the ruins of Washington, D.C. This same model of armor was described as standard issue for lower-ranked members of the Brotherhood of Steel, common enough to be encountered regularly by anyone moving through those territories. In the ruins of this part of Massachusetts, that same model is treated as a significant discovery. Rare, valuable, worth the effort of climbing to a rooftop to retrieve. No record accounts for the armor becoming scarcer in the decade between those 2 points in history. It did not disappear from the broader lore of the wasteland. It simply became harder to find in this region, without explanation, as though scarcity arrived quietly and no one thought to document when it began. The armor stands on the roof regardless, waiting in the open air, its original occupant unrecorded. That armor was not the only thing waiting inside this building. In early records of the museum's occupation, the group of Minutemen, a civilian militia organization that had once protected settlements across the northeast ruins before suffering catastrophic losses at a town called Quincy, sheltered here in larger numbers than what the final accounts describe. Earlier versions of those accounts referenced 7 survivors rather than 4, and noted that 2 of them were intended to carry detailed personal histories connected to the fall at Quincy, with conversations that would have given the militia's collapse a more specific human shape. Those histories were removed before the accounts were finalized. The individuals they belonged to were cut from the record entirely. What remained in certain archived files were fragments, brief, incomplete exchanges about Quincy, about what was lost there, attached to names that no longer existed anywhere else. The museum held the outline of a larger story. The story itself was taken away, and only its outline remained. The floorboards on the ground level creak under any weight, even now. Among the details connected to the museum's more immediate dangers, one involves the creature that descended on the surrounding streets during the period of the Minutemen's occupation. The Deathclaw, a large, heavily built predator engineered from modified chameleon DNA during pre-war military research into biological weapons, followed a specific approach path toward the building. That path passed through a section of collapsed architecture near the museum's eastern side. For approximately 2 seconds during its approach, the creature's physical form and the building's geometry occupied the same space. The creature moved through solid material. This behavior was identified and recorded as a low priority issue. Cosmetic, not critical, not requiring correction. The Deathclaw continued to pass through that wall for as long as records of this place existed. The most dangerous animal in the region walked through solid stone, and the fact was noted and set aside. The Deathclaw itself, separate from that era, was given a behavior not seen in earlier records of the species. A slow, deliberate tilt of the head, designed to express something closer to curiosity than aggression, was built into its movement patterns for moments when the creature had detected a nearby sound, but had not yet identified its source. The motion was drawn from observations of large predatory birds, specifically the way a hawk orients its head toward ground-level movement before committing to a strike. Those who learned to recognize the tilt understood that it marked a window of approximately 3 seconds before the creature's attention fully locked. The most feared predator in these ruins turned its head like something listening for mice in tall grass. The gesture made it, briefly, seem almost thoughtful. Dust has gathered in the grooves of every surface along the museum's exterior walls. The bunting draped across Concord's buildings, those faded strips of red, white, and blue cloth, shares its exact visual construction with decorations found in settlements across the broader wasteland, from the walled city to the south to the coastal fishing communities far to the northeast. A single set of textile patterns was used to represent patriotic decoration in every location where such decoration appears. The implication, read literally, is that every surviving community in the region sourced its materials from the same supplier, purchased the same product, and hung the same cloth from the same type of railing. No record explains this uniformity. The texture was constructed once and placed wherever bunting was needed, because constructing it again would have taken time that could be spent on other things. The result is a wasteland where, despite everything, the decorations always match. Inside the museum's break room, past the staff lockers and the vending machine that no longer functions, a case of Nuka Quantum, the limited edition blue-glowing formula produced by the Nuka-Cola Corporation for select regional markets before the war, sits on a low shelf. Boston was not among the primary distribution regions identified in Nuka-Cola's pre-war marketing records. A case of it in a museum staff break room in Concord suggests one of several possibilities. A staff member carried it from another region. Distribution records were never complete, or the case arrived here through channels that were never documented. The bottles still glow faintly. Whatever brought them here, they outlasted the person who brought them, the building that housed them, and the company that made them. The sound in this building changes depending on where a person stands within it. Near the ground floor entrance, any sharp noise carries a heavy, close quality, bounded by stone walls and low ceilings that trap and return sound quickly. On the upper floors, those same noises arrive softened and distant, pressed thin by the layers of flooring between. This layered audio behavior was nearly removed from the final construction of this place, due to the processing demands it placed on the systems required to run it. A decision was made close to the end to keep it. The result is that moving through the museum's floors produces a subtle but continuous shift in how the building sounds, as though the structure itself is aware of where within it a person is standing. Hidden within certain archived records connected to this location is the outline of a story that was never completed. A replica musket, modeled after weapons used in bicentennial reenactments of the Revolutionary battles this museum was built to commemorate, was designed to be recovered from the exhibit hall as part of a larger effort by the Minutemen to symbolically reclaim their identity before rebuilding their actual capabilities. The musket exists in full detail within those archived records. It has no function. It carries no description. It was built to mean something within a story that was taken away, and it remained after the story was gone. A symbol with no context, sitting in the files of a place it was never placed inside. The museum still stood because no one had found a reason to tear it down, and perhaps because the ruins of everything else made its walls feel, against all reason, like a kind of shelter. South of here, through streets that grow narrower and more crowded with debris, the old city begins to assert itself. The ruins grow taller, the gaps between buildings close, and somewhere ahead, behind a wall built from salvaged metal and the memory of a sport that no one plays anymore, something that calls itself a city has been waiting. The smell reaches you before the walls do. Generator exhaust and animal heat, and the particular thickness of air that comes from too many people living too close together inside. Something that was never built to be a home. The outer wall rises above the surrounding street level. Salvaged metal and old concrete stacked into a barrier that has kept this settlement alive for generations. Music drifts from speakers mounted somewhere near the top. It is tinny and distant, and it plays without pause, because someone decided long ago that music was the kind of thing worth keeping running. Diamond City was built inside the bones of a structure that once held tens of thousands of people for a very different reason. The stadium that forms its outer boundary was modelled after Fenway Park, a real baseball ground that stood in this part of the old city before the war. The environment team that constructed this settlement studied the original stadium's dimensions carefully. Its proportions, its sight lines, the specific height of its most famous feature, and then reduced all of it. The version that exists inside these ruins is roughly 60% the size of what the real structure measured. The left field wall, known before the war as the Green Monster for its height and color, stood 37 feet tall in the original. Inside Diamond City, that same wall, now the settlement's primary defensive barrier, reaches approximately 25. The compression was never noted in any record connected to the settlement's construction. The shape was preserved. The scale was not. It stands regardless, functional and recognizable, doing a job the original wall was never designed to perform. The wall keeps things out. What it keeps out is not always acknowledged directly. Outside the main gate, on the stretch of road that leads to the entrance, 3 figures remain in the positions they were found in years ago. 2 adults, seated against the exterior face of the wall, their postures suggesting they had been leaning there for some time, before they stopped moving entirely. Between them, a smaller figure, a child, in the same orientation, facing the same direction. All 3 faced the gate. The gate was closed when they died. No record inside the settlement mentions them. No account explains why they were not admitted. They are simply there, arranged in a configuration that tells a complete story without a single word, ignored by everyone who passes them on the way inside. The gate that saved everyone within it did not save everyone who reached it. The wall that defines this place also defined, at least once, who was left outside it. The history of exclusion inside these walls runs deeper than the gate. Approximately a decade before the present, an incident referred to in local accounts as the Broken Mask event reshaped the settlement's internal politics entirely. A synth, one of the synthetic humanoids produced by a secretive scientific organization known as the Institute, operating from an undisclosed location somewhere beneath the old city, revealed its artificial nature publicly and violently. The response was the mass expulsion of anyone suspected of being a synth from within the settlement's walls. The individual who orchestrated that expulsion, Mayor McDonough, was later discovered to be a synth himself. The expulsion he led was directed against his own kind, carried out with apparent conviction, never explained or recanted. Accounts from the capital wasteland, the ruins surrounding what was once Washington, D.C., compiled from roughly the same period, describe the Institute only in whispered references and treat synthetic infiltration of human settlements as rare. The scale of the Broken Mask event, as described in local records here, implies the Institute was conducting far more aggressive operations during that same period than those earlier accounts suggested. The two sets of records were never brought into agreement with each other. Pale light settles across the market level in long, even bands between the shanty rooftops. The mayor's office, in the settlement's upper tier, holds a terminal with a scheduling log that was last updated 2 years before the current date. The entries list public appearances, ribbon cuttings, and security briefings in the dry language of administrative routine. Near the bottom of one entry, a line reads, "Follow up with H-Re situation." The initial is not expanded anywhere in the log. No individual within the settlement carries a name beginning with that letter. The appointment has no date assigned to it. Whatever the situation referred to, and whatever H was expected to contribute to its resolution, was never recorded in any subsequent entry. The log simply ends, mid-routine, with an open item that was never closed. From somewhere above the market, the radio signal carries its music down into the streets. Diamond City Radio, broadcast from a tower within the settlement by a presenter named Travis Miles, transmits a rotating selection of music recorded before the war. The recordings used in that rotation were drawn from archives of material produced during the 1940s and 1950s. Several of those recordings were originally made in stereo. Two separate audio channels designed to create a sense of spatial depth in the listening experience. For broadcast through a 200-year-old tower, those tracks were collapsed into a single channel. That process leaves marks on the audio. Certain vocal lines in the converted recordings carry a faint doubling quality, a ghost of the second channel folded into the first. Those artifacts were not corrected. They were judged to be consistent with the degraded broadcast quality that a tower of that age would naturally produce. The static and the doubling are not errors. They are the accurate sound of something very old still trying to function. Travis himself is a more complicated subject than his broadcasts suggest. His on-air presentation shifted over time, from a hesitant, self-diminishing voice that seemed to apologize for its own existence, to something steadier and more assured. That shift was the result of a personal development that changed how he carried himself, both on and off the air. However, a specific sequence of events, completed in a particular order, could produce a state in which his behavior reflected the confident version of himself, while his broadcast voice reverted entirely to the earlier, uncertain one. The two states, assured in action, doubtful in speech, could exist simultaneously within the same person. Those who encountered this described it as profoundly unsettling. The record classified it as a technical error involving a missed internal trigger. Whether the distinction between those two explanations matters is a question the record does not answer. The hum of a generator, somewhere beneath the market flooring, carries through the boards underfoot. At night, when the settlement's internal rhythm shifts and the market quiets, the Brahmin, two-headed cattle used throughout the wasteland for labor and food, move, not randomly. Every night, the animals in Diamond City navigate toward the same corner of the market level and remain there until morning. This was not arranged. No instruction produced it. The behavior emerged from the interaction between the animals' pathfinding tendencies and the particular geometry of this settlement's multi-level construction, which channels movement differently than open ground does. Left entirely to their own logic, the animals chose a spot and returned to it. The corner became theirs through repetition, not assignment. In a settlement built on decisions about who belongs where, the cattle resolved the question for themselves. The market's food vendors operate on a pricing structure that does not correspond to any visible logic of supply or scarcity. A package of fancy lads' snack cakes, a pre-war product with a shelf life measured in centuries, available in quantity from any collapsed warehouse in the region, sells for the same amount as a freshly prepared Brahmin steak sourced, slaughtered, and cooked within the settlement that morning. Age, effort, and availability produce no difference in the final price. Value in this market is determined by the social confidence of the person making the transaction, not by any property of the goods being exchanged. A snack cake that has existed since before the bombs and a meal that existed only this morning are treated as the same object. The market functions. It simply does not function the way a market is supposed to. Beneath the vendor stalls and the foot traffic and the layered construction of 2 centuries of habitation, another kind of record exists. The home plate area of the original baseball diamond, the small pentagon of hard rubber that marked the batter's position in the sport, this structure was built for. Once sat at the center of a space that was designed in an earlier version of this settlement's history to serve as a public forum. Recovered records include voiced accounts referencing a planned election process, campaign materials, scheduled debates, and a formal counting procedure. That space became instead a purchasable private residence. The political forum was replaced by a real estate transaction. The substitution was quiet and complete, and the records of what the space was meant to be exist only in archived material that was never incorporated into the settlement's final form. Through gaps in the shanty flooring, in places where construction was laid at angles that left small open sections between boards, the original surface of the baseball field is visible, brown dirt compressed and dry running in the arc of the old infield. A unique surface built for this location and found nowhere else in the wasteland. It lies beneath everything. Beneath the market, beneath the homes, beneath the paths people walk every day without knowing what they are walking over. The people who built their lives on top of it had no memory of what it had been. The ground remembered anyway. Diamond City had not survived because it was strong. It had survived because it had walls, and the willingness to decide who was allowed inside them. East of the market gates, past the narrow streets where the settlement's edge frays into open ruin, the air changes. Salt comes into it, and something older, the smell of a waterfront that has been burning slowly for 200 years. The old city grows darker and louder in that direction, and the lights that mark it are not the clean lights of a settlement with rules. They are something else entirely. The entrance is a gap in a collapsed wall, rather than a proper gate. No flag above it, no sign marking the name of the place beyond it. Just an opening in old brick and plaster, wide enough for 2 people to pass through, and a figure standing in it, who has been standing in variations of that same position for longer than most. Settlements in this territory have existed. The streets inside are narrower than Diamond City's, darker, lit by sources that were clearly chosen for availability rather than design. The air is different here, thicker, carrying the layered smell of old buildings and wood smoke, and something fermented that drifts up from somewhere below street level. Music comes from that same direction, muffled by stone and distance. The guard at the entrance, recorded in internal files under the name Claire, delivers a short address to anyone arriving for the first time. The speech concerns Good Neighbor's open policy toward those unwanted elsewhere. It is 3 sentences long. What the archived version of that address reveals is that 3 sentences were not the original length. An earlier draft ran considerably longer, covering the settlement's founding principles in detail, the reasoning behind its structure, the philosophy that shaped its rules, the specific circumstances that brought it into existence. Most of that material was removed before the final version was set. What remained was the end of a thought that had begun somewhere earlier, delivered as though the middle of the conversation had already happened. In the original draft, it had. The speech that greets every arrival in Good Neighbor is a conclusion without its argument, preserved because the conclusion was the part that mattered most. The walls carry the argument instead, spray painted across the interior surfaces of buildings throughout the settlement, in lettering that ranges from careful to frantic. are phrases that were placed as visual texture before the settlement's history was fully written. The words came first, phrases declaring that this place belongs to those who were turned away elsewhere, that no authority from outside these streets has standing here, that the people within these walls were not removed, they left and built something better. When the account of Goodneighbour's founding was later constructed, a community formed by those expelled from the walled settlement to the west, who gathered in these streets and decided to stay. The slogans on the walls became its founding documents. The environment was written before the history. The history grew up to meet the walls. In Good Neighbour, the graffiti is older than the story it tells. Dim orange light from a failing fixture above the main street flickers once, then steadies. The individual who governs this settlement does so in clothing that references a specific figure from the pre-war historical record. Hancock, the gullified mayor who has held this position for years through a combination of genuine conviction and demonstrated willingness to use force, wears a tricorn hat and a long colonial coat. Both items were documented in his character construction notes as deliberate references to John Hancock, the pre-war statesman whose signature appeared more prominently than any other on the Declaration of Independence. The ruins of this city were, before the war, closely associated with the events that document described. The museums, the walking trails, the preserved buildings. All of it existed within a few miles of these streets. The person who leads Good Neighbour dresses like a figure from that history, not as a joke, though the parallel is quiet enough to read as one, but as a sincere claim. This settlement, built by the expelled and unwanted, is governed by someone who presents himself as a founder. Further inside, past the main street, and through a door that has been repaired several times, with materials that do not quite match the original frame. The Hotel Rexford offers lodging at a modest rate. Its lobby holds a chandelier. The chandelier is an unusual object for this space. Its construction is more detailed than any comparable fixture found anywhere else in these ruins, with a complexity of form that suggests it was built for a location significantly grander than a working-class inn in an outcast settlement. The records of its origin point toward a planned interior space in the financial district ruins to the west, a location that was never completed. The chandelier was built for a room that was never built. It was placed here instead, hanging above a water-stained floor and mismatched furniture, casting the kind of light that the space around it has no use for. It remains. The room it was designed for does not exist. Beneath the hotel, below street level, another kind of space operates under different principles. The memory den is run by a ghoul physician named Dr. Amari. The technology she maintains allows individuals to experience recorded memories, their own or those belonging to others, through a chair that interfaces directly with neural activity. In an earlier version of this settlement's history, that technology was intended to offer access to a much wider range of stored experiences. Records of those earlier plans contain partial frameworks for memory sequences belonging to the mayor, to the overseer of a distant vault, and to at least 2 individuals connected to the walled settlement to the west. None of those sequences were completed. The chair that could have shown anyone's past was ultimately used to show exactly 2 specific sets of memories. The same 2 in every account of the settlement's history, while everything else it was capable of revealing remains stored and inaccessible. The machine built to uncover what is hidden kept most of what it knew to itself. The air near the building's lower level carries a faint mineral cold that rises through the floorboards, not far from the memory den's entrance, toward the edge of the settlement where Good Neighbour's boundaries meet the open ruins of the surrounding district. The old state house stands largely intact. Its interior was constructed in considerable detail. 2 floors of government office geometry, working fixtures, furniture arranged as it might have been in a functioning administrative space. A planned investigation into pre-war records stored in the building's lower level would have brought this interior into direct relevance. That investigation was removed from the settlement's history before it was ever carried out. The interior was not removed with it. Every surface remains. Every terminal is present. One of those terminals holds a single line of text placed during construction as a reminder to whoever came next. This terminal will contain quest-relevant data. No one came next. The reminder survived as the final content of the terminal. A note addressed to a future that did not arrive, preserved exactly where it was left. The settlement's guards maintain a patrol pattern that covers most of the main street. Good Neighbor is among the few places in the wasteland where ghouls and humans occupy the same space without that arrangement being treated as unusual. The ghouls here are residents, not threats. The humans here have accepted that distinction. The faction logic that governs hostility between species, however, operates on a brief delay, approximately 2 seconds, before newly encountered creatures are assigned their correct designation. A feral ghoul, driven by radiation damage beyond any functioning thought, occasionally crosses the settlement's boundary from the surrounding streets during this window. For those 2 seconds, it is neither resident nor enemy. It simply stands at the threshold, unclassified, before the designation resolves and the guards respond. Those who have observed this moment describe the pause as the settlement briefly considering the question. The answer is always the same, but the question is always asked. The music from below the street grows clearer near the entrance to the third rail. Magnolia performs there most nights. The songs she performs were not recorded before the war, not drawn from any archive of pre-war material, not licensed from any source outside this settlement. They were written for her. Original compositions built to sound like music from the 1940s, carrying the structure and feeling of that era without belonging to it. Her complete performance, including every song and every line of spoken dialogue connected to her time on that stage, was recorded in a single continuous session lasting nearly 4 hours. No breaks were taken. The result is a catalogue of entirely new music presented in the voice of something very old, a ghoul performing original work in the style of a period she may well have lived through, in a bar, beneath a settlement that should not exist, in the ruins of a city that no longer has an audience for it. Every other broadcast in the wasteland draws from the same pre-war archive. Magnolia draws from nothing but herself. The bar she performs in is run by a ghoul named Whitechapel Charlie. The beverages served at the third rail are branded products of the Gwinnett Brewing Company, a pre-war operation whose product line included Gwinnett Ale, Gwinnett Beer, Gwinnett Lager, Gwinnett Pale Ale, and Gwinnett Stout. Each carries a distinct name, a distinct label, and a distinct implied character. Each produces identical effects on anyone who drinks it. The entire range of the brewery's surviving output, 5 named varieties, sold separately, priced individually, functions as a single product distributed across 5 containers. Whether the differences that existed before the war have simply been lost to time, or whether the distinctions were never more than marketing to begin with, the records do not clarify. The bar stocks all 5. The effect of drinking any one of them is the same as drinking any other. Good Neighbor had made a rule of having no rules, and in doing so, it had become, in its own broken way, the most honest place in the wasteland. West of these streets, where the buildings spread out and the gaps between them grow wider, the character of the ruins shifts into something older and more mechanical. The smell changes, chemical grease and rust, and the particular staleness of large enclosed spaces that were sealed mid-operation. Factory buildings rise in that direction, their assembly lines still loaded, and their production floors still lit by emergency power that has been running without interruption since before anyone now alive was born. The structure announces itself before the entrance does. Steel catwalks connect sections of the upper building above street level. crossing gaps where the exterior walls have partially separated from the main frame. The parking lot spreads out to the south in a wide, flat expanse of cracked asphalt and rusted shapes. The smell here is old oil and oxidized metal, and the dry, closed quality of a large interior space that has not been properly ventilated in a very long time. Somewhere inside, at a height that places it above most of the surrounding ruins, a guard post has been constructed from salvaged materials. A figure moves across it slowly, following a path that covers the same ground at the same intervals, watching the road below. The Corvega assembly plant was modelled after the large automotive manufacturing facilities that operated across the American industrial belt during the mid-20th century. Specifically, the design, conventions of factory complexes built in Detroit during the decades following the Second World War. The environment team that constructed this building worked from research into actual production floor layouts, incorporating suspended track systems, conveyor platforms, and hydraulic press bays that reflect genuine manufacturing architecture of that period. None of this equipment serves any function within the building as it currently stands. It was built to be accurate, not useful. On the upper production levels, unfinished car bodies remain in their track mounts, suspended mid-assembly, held at the exact point in the production sequence where the line stopped. The components they were waiting for never arrived. The cars hang there still, incomplete, in a factory that was built to complete things. The brand Fossers carried tells a different story depending on which records are consulted. Corvega vehicles appear throughout the wasteland in the form of wrecked hulks lining roads and filling lots across the eastern territories. Earlier records compiled from the ruins surrounding what was once Washington, D.C., describe Corvega automobiles as pre-war luxury goods, middle-class status symbols associated with personal prosperity and upward mobility. The terminal records housed within this plant tell a different account. According to those internal documents, Corvega production was subsidized by the federal government and carried out under direct military contract as part of civilian infrastructure programs during the resource conflicts of the pre-war period. The cars were not a luxury product. They were a government-managed utility, manufactured at scale because the administration required them, not because the market demanded them. The two accounts of the same brand exist in the same wasteland without being reconciled. One version was written first. The other was written later without checking what had already been recorded. Dust has accumulated along every horizontal surface inside the production floor, undisturbed for generations. On the third floor, past a stairwell that has partially collapsed on one side, a break room holds the remains of a celebration that was prepared but never held. A plastic cake model sits on a table surrounded by overturned chairs and scattered decorative materials. A terminal beside the table contains a single entry from a shift supervisor dated October 20th, 2077, 3 days before the bombs fell. The entry announces a retirement party for a co-worker named Dell, scheduled for the following Saturday. The party supplies on the table correspond to the event described in the entry. The date of that Saturday was October 26th. The bombs fell on the 23rd. Dell's retirement party was set up before it was needed. The table was arranged, the materials were laid out. And then the morning of October 23rd arrived, and the morning of October 26th never did. The cake is still on the table. The chairs have not been uprighted. Further along the production floor, charging stations mounted into the factory's power infrastructure hold fusion cores. Cylindrical energy cells used to power the large, mechanized suits known as power armor. The cores in those mounts have been seated there for 2 centuries. They register as fully charged. The systems that govern energy storage in this territory operate on the assumption that a cell held in a charging mount does not deplete over time, regardless of how much time passes. 200 years of sitting in a sealed mount produces the same result as 2 hours. The pre-war engineers who designed these storage units built them to a standard that, whether intentionally or not, outlasted every reasonable expectation of their operational lifespan. The cores wait at full capacity, as though the workers who last checked them stepped away only recently. Beneath the sounds of occupation and structural movement, the building carries another layer entirely. The ambient audio of the Corvega plant includes a persistent low hum recorded from a functioning manufacturing facility on the east coast of the pre-war world during an early research phase of the building's construction. That recording was layered into the plant's sound environment at a volume below most other active sounds, present but not prominent, detectable only in stretches of relative quiet. Those who cleared the building of its current occupants and then remained still in its deeper sections reported hearing what seemed like distant machinery still in operation. The sound was not machinery. It was a recording of machinery captured decades ago at a facility that may no longer exist. The factory that sounds like it might still be running is producing that impression from a document of something real, preserved in the walls of something fictional, playing on a loop in the quiet. The occupants who have taken up positions throughout the structure maintain a level of tactical organization not typically associated with raider camps elsewhere in the region. Guard posts are positioned to cover specific approach angles. Patrol rotations follow timed sequences rather than random paths. Elevated positions are held by individuals whose sight lines cover the main entrance and the surrounding lot. The degree of coordination reflects a deliberate design decision. This location was considered significant enough to warrant occupants, whose behavior would make reaching its interior feel appropriately difficult. The raiders here are not more dangerous, because the account of this place describes them as more capable. They are more dangerous, because the location required it, and the behavior was constructed to match. Their leader carries records that complicate the straightforward account of who these occupants are. The individual identified in internal files as Jared holds a holotape containing a partial tactical plan for an operation against the super mutant population occupying Lexington below. The plan covers approach vectors, timing considerations, and contingencies for different defensive configurations. It is the work of someone who thinks in coordinated sequences, who maps threats before engaging them, who considers outcomes beyond the immediate moment. The same individual encountered directly presents no evidence of this capacity. He is an obstacle, removed without conversation. The holotape he carries suggests a person the building's account never develops. In these ruins, what a person was capable of is sometimes preserved only in the documents found on their body after the fact. From the upper catwalks, the compressed street grid of the surrounding suburb is visible below. The town of Lexington, that spreads out beneath the plant's elevated walkways, was built from a simplified interpretation of the real geographic layout of a Massachusetts suburb that bore that name before the war. Several blocks were condensed into a single navigable area. The actual distance between the town center and the factory in the pre-war world was significantly greater than what the ruins represent. Those familiar with the real location noticed the compression immediately. The version that exists in these ruins is not a reconstruction of a place that existed. It is a representation of the general concept of a place, a Massachusetts suburb, arranged to function as one, without being required to match any specific one. The gap between the represented and the real was not noted in any connected record. In the lot below, the gap takes a different form. Every wrecked Corvega vehicle in the parking area shares the same underlying structure, the same frame, the same door positions, the same proportions, differentiated only by color and varying degrees of surface rust. The Corvega product line, as physically represented in this location, consisted of one vehicle. The pre-war automotive industry that this factory was part of produced, in terms of actual form, a single object distributed across multiple paint applications, Whether this reflects a genuine aspect of wartime standardization in manufacturing, a real reduction in model variety driven by material scarcity and government contract requirements, or simply a practical decision made during the building's construction, the result is the same. Every car in the lot is the same car. The variety is only on the surface. At the far end of the lower loading dock, past the sections most people move through, on the way to something else, 6 Corvega automobiles sit in shipping position. Their paint is largely intact. Their surfaces carry far less rust than anything else in the lot. They were completed, checked, and staged for collection. The transport that would have taken them never arrived. Requisitioned, destroyed, or simply overtaken by events that made the delivery irrelevant. The cars have been in their shipping positions for 2 centuries, finished and ready, waiting for a transaction that the world ended before it could complete. No record marks them as significant. They are simply there at the end of a dock, in the part of the building that most people never reach. The plant had been built to make things, and it had made them, right up until the moment there was no longer anywhere for the things to go. Southeast of here, where the industrial zone gives way to a different kind of ruin, the buildings change character. They grow more deliberate in their construction, designed for research rather than production, built for institutions rather than output. A communications tower breaks the flat line of the horizon in that direction, and around it, the remains of a campus that was pointed at something far above the atmosphere, still reaching upward from the ground. The building identifies itself from a distance. A communications tower rises above the surrounding campus structures, visible through the gaps between collapsed university buildings that line the approach from the west. The signage on the outer wall still carries the company's name and its logo. A stylized arc tracing the trajectory of something launched upward, climbing away from the ground on a clean curved line. The same arc appears on the facility's internal documentation, on its equipment labels, on the small metal plates fixed beside every sealed security door along the main corridor. The air inside carries the particular stillness of a space that was designed to be climate controlled and has been maintaining that condition imperfectly through systems that were never meant to run unattended for 2 centuries. Arkjet Systems was constructed in reference to the large aerospace research campuses built by American government agencies during the Cold War period of the 20th century. The sprawling, low-profile facility complexes that housed propulsion laboratories, wind tunnels, and classified testing programs under the language of civilian scientific progress. The architectural vocabulary of those real facilities is present throughout this building. The long administrative corridors, the observation windows overlooking testing bays, the clean institutional surfaces that communicate seriousness without warmth. The logo on the wall simultaneously references 2 things: the arc of a rocket climbing toward orbit and the arc of a ballistic warhead descending toward a target follow the same geometric curve. Arkjet produced technology for both applications. The same image covered both products. The company made things that flew upward and things that came down, and it used one symbol to represent both directions. Faint emergency lighting runs along the floor of the main corridor in a continuous amber line. Among the records still accessible on the executive terminal at the top of the facility, the performance review system logged its final entry on October 17, 2077, 6 days before the bombs fell. The subject of that review is identified as Chen P., an engineer whose assessment carries the highest available rating and a formal recommendation for accelerated advancement within the organization. The adjacent personnel file expands the record: a hire date, a list of completed projects, and a single emergency contact. The contact is listed as Chen R., identified as a sister. No other individual named Chen appears in any terminal across the entire facility. The review is the last formal acknowledgement, that this person existed within this institution. It was written 6 days before the institution, and the person ceased to have a future. The promotion was recommended. The promotion was never processed. The record of someone doing excellent work at the moment everything ended is preserved in a terminal that no one in the building was left to read. The project Chen was working on connects to a deeper absence within this structure. In earlier accounts of Arkjet's history, the facility was linked to a larger program involving the construction of a civilian orbital platform. A project contracted through Vault-Tec, the corporation responsible for the pre-war Vault construction program, which had apparently extended its interests into aerospace infrastructure during the final years before the war. Partial records reference an orbital component that was stored in the building's lowest basement level. The basement exists. It is accessible. It is entirely empty. The component was removed from the account of this place before that account was finalized. But the space built to house it was not removed with it. The room at the bottom of Arkjet Systems was designed to contain humanity's most ambitious reach towards space. It contains nothing. The ambition was taken away, and the room was left behind, sealed and purposeless, at the lowest point of a building that was pointed at the sky. Above that empty basement, the XMB booster engine, Arkjet's experimental deep space propulsion system, occupies its test bay in a state of functional readiness. The engine generates lethal radiation output when active. Its operating radius extends beyond the boundaries of the designated safe area marked within the test bay's geometry. Those who positioned themselves at the outer edges of the marked zone during engine activation still registered radiation exposure, despite standing within the boundaries that were supposed to protect them. This discrepancy was identified, documented, and classified as an acceptable variance. A difference between what the safe zone promised and what the engine actually produced that was judged too minor to require correction. The boundary between survivable and lethal in this room is larger than the markings suggest. The engine operates within its stated parameters. The parameters were simply never fully accurate. The radiation that engine produces represents only one inconsistency in Arkjet's relationship with the broader record of pre-war technology. Accounts compiled from the Western Territories, from the ruins of California and Nevada, where the earliest surviving records of post-war civilization originate, describe a technological landscape defined by nuclear power management, basic computing systems, and early robotics. Those accounts, which predate the events in these eastern ruins by several decades, treat space exploration as a peripheral ambition rather than an active program. Arkjet's Deep Space Engine program suggests that the Eastern Research Corridor was pursuing propulsion technology capable of interstellar application, while the West was still managing fission reactors. No record in either body of documentation acknowledges this gap. The two regions developed along different trajectories, reached different technical horizons, and the disparity was never explained by any source connected to either location. Stale air moves through the ventilation system in slow, irregular cycles. In the brake area adjacent to the engine test bay, a chessboard sits on a table with its pieces in mid-game positions. The white side appears to have been approaching a decisive advantage. At the moment the match was interrupted, the board position was constructed from an actual recorded game, specifically a configuration reached during a World Championship match played in 1972. Whether this was placed as a deliberate reference to that specific contest, or simply represented a chess position that the person arranging it happened to remember, the record does not confirm. The match was paused at a moment of genuine tension, with the outcome still in question despite White's advantage. 2 centuries have passed. The pieces have not moved. The game remains exactly as unresolved as the moment it was left. Throughout the facility's laboratory corridors, the synthetic humanoids known as Generation 1 synths the earliest production model created by the Institute, constructed with fully visible mechanical components rather than biological covering, follow movement patterns governed by a wall avoidance protocol. The protocol maintains a fixed minimum distance between the unit and any nearby surface, preventing navigation errors caused by contact with geometry. In the open spaces of larger facilities, this produces standard patrol behavior. Inside Arkjet's narrow research corridors, the same protocol causes Generation 1 units to converge towards the center of each hallway, moving in tight parallel formation rather than spreading across the available width, observed through the facility's internal observation windows from above. A group of these units moving through the lower corridors resembles a production line, identical mechanical figures advancing in sequence along a fixed central path. The machines built to resemble humans move, in the right conditions, like products on an assembly track. Cold recycled air carries a faint metallic quality through every section of the building. Within the engine test bay, mounted into the electromagnetic infrastructure that supports the XMB system, several industrial-grade magnetic units are fixed in permanent positions. Their weight, recorded in the facility's physical inventory system, is listed at the maximum measurable value, a figure used throughout the territory's cataloging systems as a standard designation for any object too heavy to be moved by available means. The walls of the building itself carry the same designation. A structural wall and a high-powered magnet are, within the weight classification system applied to this facility, identical objects. Both are assigned the same number. Both are categorized as immovable. The distinction between a piece of installed equipment and the building that contains it was resolved within the inventory system by giving them the same value. The arithmetic was convenient. The distinction was not considered important enough to preserve. There is one final quality of this building that no visual inspection reveals. The ambient sound environment of Arkjet's interior includes a frequency component recorded during the post-production phase of the facility's construction. A subsonic element operating at approximately 18 to 19 cycles per second, below the threshold of conscious hearing for most people under normal listening conditions. Psychoacoustic research conducted before the war identified this frequency range as associated with mild perceptual effects, including low-level unease, heightened awareness of peripheral movement, and the subjective sensation of being observed. Whether this frequency was introduced deliberately to produce those effects, or emerged as an incidental byproduct of layering multiple recorded industrial sounds together, was never confirmed in any documentation connected to the facility's audio construction. Those who have spent extended time within these walls using equipment sensitive enough to detect low-frequency output that Arkjet produces a consistent response that other locations of comparable physical design do not. The building may be constructed to feel wrong. The construction, if it was intentional, worked. Arkjet had been reaching for something beyond the atmosphere, building engines powerful enough to leave the world behind. And in the end, the world had left first. Southwest of the campus, past the highway wreckage and the thinning tree line, the landscape undergoes a change that has no equivalent anywhere else in the region. The ground drops, the craters multiply. The sky takes on a quality of light that does not correspond to any weather condition. A faint, persistent luminescence that exists at ground level rather than above it, rising from the earth rather than falling onto it. There are no settlements in that direction. There are no lights from human occupation. There is only the color the sky became in the place where the bomb actually landed. There is no clean way to describe what the sky looks like here. The color exists somewhere between gray and green, with a quality of light that seems to originate from the ground rather than filtering down from above. It is not weather. It is not time of day. It is the permanent atmospheric condition of a place where something was detonated at sufficient force to alter the chemistry of the air itself and keep it altered for 200 years. The craters begin at the outer edge and deepen toward the center, overlapping in places where secondary pressure waves produce their own depressions in the earth. Nothing that was built here is still standing in recognizable form. Nothing that was planted here grows in any way that resembles what it was before. The silence is not the silence of an empty place. It is the silence of a place where most things capable of making noise have already adapted to this environment or died in it. The terrain at the center of this zone was shaped by an event on October 23rd, 2077, when a nuclear warhead made direct contact with what had been the southwestern residential outskirts of Boston. The geography that resulted from that contact was constructed using terrain modeling tools adapted from those used to shape the region's water features. Its riverbeds, its coastal inlets, its flooded, low-lying areas. The deepest depression at the center of this zone was formed using the same methodology applied to the bottom of a lake. The bomb created a shape, and the shape required a tool designed for depths, and the only tool available for depths was the one used for water. The crater at the center of the glowing sea is, in its geometric construction, a lake that contains no water. The instrument of destruction left behind a form that the environment team could only model as absence. A thin electromagnetic crackle moves through the air at irregular intervals, like something vast trying to discharge. Around the outer boundary of the zone, where the blast radius faded into survivable levels of destruction, residential structures remain in partial form. Houses, garages, boundary walls, all present in states consistent with overpressure wave damage rather than direct thermal exposure. Walls pushed inward toward the structure's interior rather than outward away from it. Roofs collapsed in the direction the force came from, rather than simply falling under gravity. Vehicles displaced from their original positions and deposited at angles that recorded the direction of the wave that moved them. The environment team researched documented records of nuclear test site damage to model these collapse patterns with accuracy. Every structure at the edge of this zone fell in a specific direction. That direction is still readable in the way the rubble is arranged. 2 centuries of weathering have not erased the geometry of what happened here. Closer to the center, the structures that survived the outer ring give way entirely. The glowing one, a ghoul whose radiation absorption has reached a threshold at which the body itself becomes a source of radioactive emission rather than merely a vessel for it, occupies fixed territories within this zone that correspond to areas of peak radiation concentration. These territories are maintained with a consistency that does not waver under external pressure. A glowing one engaged in conflict at the boundary of its territory will not cross that boundary in pursuit. It stops. The line holds regardless of circumstance. Whatever internal process defines the boundary of a glowing one's range functions, independently of the situation it finds itself in. The creature will retreat, will disengage, will stand at the edge of its territory, and simply cease to pursue. The radiation encoded in its body and the territory encoded in its behavior share the same quality. Neither was chosen, and neither can be discarded. The death claws that occupy the same zone in greater concentrations than anywhere else in the Eastern Territories move through this landscape, using navigation systems designed for flat, open ground. The cratered terrain of the zone's interior presents slope angles that those navigation systems were never calibrated to handle. When a deathclaw enters a crater depression steep enough to exceed the limits of its pathfinding resolution, it continues attempting to move forward, running in place against the crater wall with full mechanical commitment of a creature that has not been told the obstacle is impassable, observed from any elevated position. The rim of a nearby crater, the partial remains of an outer structure. This produces the image of the region's most formidable predator, applying its full effort to a problem that its own systems have made unsolvable. The geography defeated the creatures that were adapted to live within it, and the creatures have not been informed. The ambient crackling intensifies briefly near the larger crater formations, then settles back to its baseline level. Near the northwestern boundary of the zone, partially buried in debris beside what was once a road, a National Guard transport vehicle holds a holotape in a condition too damaged for full playback. The portions that remain audible include a date, October 23rd, 2077, a unit designation, and a phrase repeated 3 times in succession before the recording ends. We are not leaving anyone. The tape is not connected to any documented objective within the zone. It carries no marker. It is not required for any recorded purpose. It is simply there, in the wreckage of a vehicle that was moving toward the blast rather than away from it, containing the last words of soldiers who made a decision about direction on the morning. The bombs fell. Whether they found anyone is not recorded. The tape ends before the answer. The religious community known as the Children of Atom maintains a settlement within the zone, at a location called the Crater of Atom. The Children of Atom first appeared in earlier records from the capital wasteland, where a small group gathered around an undetonated nuclear device at the center of a settlement called Megaton, and treated its potential detonation as a form of divine expression. Those records describe the group as marginal, largely non-threatening, regarded by other residents as unusual rather than dangerous. The chapter established within this zone operates according to a different set of parameters: armed, structured, capable of organized violence, and resistant to outside contact. The decade separating the two records does not provide sufficient basis for the transformation they represent. No account of how the Children of Atom developed from the group described in earlier records into the organization present here was ever produced. They changed between documents, and the change was never explained. The settlement they built sits over something older. At the crater's edge, beneath the structures the Children of Atom raised over it, a foundation is visible in the exposed geology. Brick and stone construction, consistent with pre-war New England, building from the 19th century. The original structure may have been a farmhouse, a small institutional building, or a place of worship of a very different kind. The Children of Atom constructed their shrine directly above it, without noting what was already there. The foundation predates the bomb, predates the cult, predates the radiation that defined the zone. It was buried not by the explosion, but by everything that came after. The foundation remains beneath the current structure, present and unacknowledged, carrying the shape of whatever this ground held before it became sacred to people who arrived later. The sound of the zone was captured from real electrical infrastructure. The electromagnetic interference that defines the glowing sea's audio environment. Its persistent crackling undercurrent, its radiation surge pulses, its layered quality of something perpetually discharging, was constructed from recordings made near high-voltage transmission lines during variable weather conditions. The sound was not synthesized. It was documented. Someone positioned a recording device near real electrical infrastructure and captured what that infrastructure sounded like, then layered those recordings into the ambient track of the most hostile environment in the region. The crackling that fills this zone originated in a real place, under real power lines, recorded by a real person who then left and went somewhere else. The zone sounds the way it does because of that documented moment. Within the zone, in a cave set into a crater wall, in the interior of the glowing sea, a former institute researcher named Brian Virgil maintains a working laboratory. Virgil administered a modified version of the forced evolutionary virus, a mutagenic compound developed by West-Tec Research under pre-war military contract, to his own biology as a means of escaping an institution whose ethical direction he could no longer support. The transformation changed his physical form entirely. His laboratory contains the evidence of someone who did not stop working when he left. Research notes, personal records, active equipment, the ongoing documentation of a problem that defined him before the Institute and continues to define him after it. The space was constructed as a direct expression of its occupant. Every object placed to reflect not what Virgil needed functionally, but who he was and what he was still trying to resolve. A room was built as a portrait. The portrait is accurate. Rad-X, the anti-radiation compound produced before the war by pharmaceutical manufacturers operating under federal contract, is consumed in quantity by anyone who spends extended time within this zone. The compound's listed duration of effect covers 1 hour of active exposure. Multiple doses, taken in sequence, produce no documented interaction, no diminishing effectiveness, no threshold beyond which the body's capacity to process the medication is exceeded. The pre-war pharmaceutical industry, in its production of this compound, apparently solved the problem of radiation medicine in a form that does not degrade, does not lose potency, and does not accumulate to harmful levels regardless of how much is taken or how quickly. 200 years after the last manufacturing facility closed, the medication still performs exactly as its label described. The label has not been updated. There is nothing to update. The glowing sea did not ask to be what it was. It was simply what remained in the place where the worst thing happened, and it had found, over 2 centuries, its own kind of life. North of this zone, through terrain that gradually releases its hold on the worst of the radiation, the landscape softens back into something that resembles ordinary ruin. Farmland returns. Structures appear at intervals that suggest habitation rather than abandonment. And at a certain point along that northern approach, set into a hillside at the edge of open fields, a vault door is visible. One that has been opened and left that way, its residents choosing to face the outside rather than remain sealed within. The lights from inside reach the surrounding grass in a warm, steady line. The door is open. That detail distinguishes this vault from almost every other facility of its kind across the Eastern Territories. The blast door, the heavy circular mechanism designed by the Vault-Tec Corporation to seal its occupants away from everything outside, stands in its open position, fixed there not by malfunction, but by choice. The residents of Vault 81 decided, at some point after the war ended and the world outside became survivable, to leave the door open and see what came through it. What came through it was trade and contact and a slow accumulation of outside knowledge, and eventually the kind of community that functions because it faces outward rather than inward. The vault smells like warm meals and recycled air. Children move through the corridors. Someone is having a conversation at normal volume in the common area. For a vault, this is extraordinary. Vault 81 was built with a specific experimental purpose that its residents were never told about. The Vault-Tec Corporation, the private contractor responsible for designing and constructing the pre-war vault network under government contract, designated this facility as a site for testing experimental disease treatments, with the vault's population serving as the subject pool for those trials. The residents would have been the experiment. The contrast between what this vault became and what it was designed to be was built into its architecture deliberately. The warmth of its current community placed in direct opposition to the intended fate of its founders. The experiment was never carried out. The community that exists here is the result of that failure. Soft yellow light runs along the corridor ceiling in even panels, most of them still functional. The reason the experiment was never carried out is documented in the sealed laboratory section of the vault, accessible through a restricted passage in the facility's lower level. Dr. Olivet, the lead researcher assigned to implement Vault-Tec's program, left a record of her decision across multiple terminal entries, distributed throughout her workspace in non-sequential order. The entries do not announce their significance. They appear as routine research logs, indistinguishable in format from administrative documentation, and most who encounter them do so in the order physical proximity suggests, rather than the order in which they were written. Read by date, reconstructed from the timestamps attached to each entry. Those logs describe a complete internal transformation. A researcher moving from professional compliance through mounting doubt and into active resistance, ultimately choosing to dismantle the program she was employed to run. The complete account of that moral process exists within those terminals. It is available to anyone who takes the time to arrange the entries correctly. Most do not. What her resistance preserved was the community that now occupies these corridors. What it left behind was a sealed door. In the laboratory section's easternmost section, a corridor terminates at a door that has not been opened through any recorded means. The space beyond it was intended to extend the laboratory into a second tier. Additional research facilities and a separate residential wing for the scientific staff, designed to keep the experiment's administrators isolated from the subject population. That expansion was removed from the vault's construction before it was finalized. But the connecting door was not removed with it. The door leads to a rendered space of approximately 40 square meters that is otherwise empty. A room that was the beginning of a larger design, preserved at its starting point, with nothing beyond. The depth of the secret this vault was meant to keep was intended to be greater than the depth that remains. The sealed door in the wall is the only evidence of how much deeper it was supposed to go. The corridors in the sealed section carry a different quality of air, stale and slightly warmer than the inhabited portions of the vault. Through the vents of that sealed section, mole rats, rodents common throughout the eastern wasteland, adapted to underground habitation, found entry at some point before the current occupants of the vault traced the source of what they carried. The mole rats present in the lower laboratory section are vectors for a disease that does not behave like any other infection documented in the region. The condition it produces reduces the physical resilience of anyone it affects in a manner that persists indefinitely and cannot be reversed without a specific cure. The animals that carry it are visually indistinguishable from every other mole rat in the territory. They carry no marking. Their behavior does not indicate their status as disease vectors. They simply bite, and the reduction remains. The most consequential animals in Vault 81 look exactly like the least consequential ones. The human cost of what those animals carry is recorded in a child's handwriting. Austin Engel, a young resident of Vault 81 whose infection drove the search for the cure stored in the sealed laboratory, kept a personal journal on his terminal before he fell ill. The entries span several months and used the vocabulary and sentence structure of a child navigating a world that is for him simply the world he knows. He writes about meals and friends, and the sections of the vault that feel different from the sections he is allowed in. One entry, dated 6 days before his illness began, describes an exploration of a maintenance corridor, where he found a gap in the wall that something had been using to come through. He describes it with excitement rather than concern. He had located the source of his own infection and recorded it as a discovery worth sharing. The cause of what was about to happen to him was documented by the person it was about to happen to, without any awareness of what had been found. Warm light from the common area spills into the adjacent corridor in a thin line under the door. Vault 81's physician, Dr. Forsyth, holds the only available dose of the cure developed in the sealed laboratory. The choice of what to do with that dose carries a stated consequence. The child either receives it or does not. If the dose is withheld, Austin is described as transferred to the medical bay for ongoing management of his condition. Subsequent visits to the vault show him recovered, moving through the corridors, resuming his previous activities, indistinguishable from a child who was never ill. The consequence that was articulated never manifests in any observable form. Austin's recovery was resolved in the Vault's records as a fixed outcome regardless of the decision that preceded it. The moral weight of the choice exists entirely within the moment of making it. After that moment, the weight is gone, and the child is always fine. The Vault's economy reflects a different kind of consequence, one that accumulated over time without anyone deciding it should. Vault 81 accepts bottle caps as currency in its trade with surface settlements. The bottle cap standard was established as a formal monetary system by the New California Republic in the Western Territories, where the caps were backed by reserve holdings and treated as legal tender. That system spread eastward through informal channels over the decades following the war, eventually becoming the standard medium of exchange across most of the eastern wasteland. Vault 81's adoption of that standard implies sustained contact with the outside economy. Contact measured not in weeks, but in years or decades. Long enough for the Vault's residents to understand what bottle caps represented and accept them as meaningful. The Vault that was sealed against the outside world had been trading with it for long enough to learn its currency. The Overseer's office holds a display case containing pre-war baseballs. 9 of them arranged on 2 shelves, each one fully formed and physically identical to the baseballs found throughout the surrounding territory. Those external baseballs can be picked up and carried. The ones in the case cannot. A single property assigned to each object in the case, a designation marking it as display material rather than available inventory, separates them from every functionally identical object outside these walls. The baseballs in the case and the baseballs in the wasteland are the same object. One category can be touched. The other exists only to be observed. The difference between them is one line in the record of what each object is permitted to be. The cafeteria down the corridor serves meals on a posted schedule. Vault 81's community, its scheduled dining, its functioning school, its maintained recreational spaces. Its children who play without apparent awareness that any of this is unusual, was built to pose a question that most vaults in this territory answer differently. The question is what survival looks like when it is not being tested. Most vaults in the Eastern Wasteland are records of what institutions do to people when the institution's interests and the people's interests diverge. Vault 81 is a record of what remains when a single person chose, at the cost of her career and possibly her safety, to prevent that divergence from occurring. The cafeteria, the school, the children, all of it exists because Dr. Olivet took her research notes and destroyed the program they were meant to support. The healthiest vault in the region is healthy because its experiment was sabotaged before it began. Vault 81 had become something Vault-Tec never planned for, a community that simply chose, quietly and stubbornly, to take care of each other. Deeper underground, unreachable by any route marked on the surface maps of this territory, something else waits. Clean corridors, fluorescent light with no flicker, the hum of systems that have never been allowed to degrade. Whatever is down there has been working without interruption since before the war ended, and it has been making decisions about the territory above it for longer than most of the territory's current residents have been alive. Nothing accumulates here. That is the first thing to notice. No dust on the corridor floors, no rust on the wall panels, no evidence of the 2 centuries that passed on the surface, no cracked plaster, no water damage, no slow decay of materials left unattended for longer than any material was designed to last. The lighting is even and soft, distributed from panels, set flush into a ceiling that shows no staining, no sagging, no evidence of age. The air moves through ventilation systems that were maintained after the war ended, serviced by people who were born here and who will likely die here, because leaving was never part of the design. The corridors are white. The floors are white. The surfaces between them are white. It does not feel like a place that was built to be lived in. It feels like a place that was built to be controlled. The whiteness was a decision about power, before it was a decision about appearance. The visual architecture of the Institute, the clean surfaces, the modular construction, the soft institutional lighting, was drawn from the design language of high-security research facilities, corporate clean rooms, and certain categories of psychiatric institution. These are spaces where cleanliness is not a result of regular maintenance, but an enforced condition, sustained because disorder of any kind, physical, behavioral, procedural, represents a failure of control. The Institute does not look the way it does because the people who built it valued aesthetics. It looks the way it does because the people who designed it understood that an environment without accumulation is an environment that announces continuously and without a single spoken word that the people within it are being managed. The whiteness is the message. The message was intended. Pale fluorescent light reflects evenly off every surface in the main corridor, producing no shadows of any depth. The messaging system accessible on terminals throughout the facility contains an archive of internal communications spanning approximately 40 years of institutional history, read from the beginning, from the earliest entries when the facility was newly established and its population was small. The messages describe an organization oriented around genuine scientific inquiry. Researchers discuss problems collaboratively. Departments share resources without formal procedure. The tone is curious, occasionally informal, marked by the kind of investment that comes from people who believe the work they are doing matters. The later entries carry a different quality. Resource allocation becomes the subject of formal dispute. Security protocols are introduced, debated, and eventually treated as standard. Disciplinary procedures appear in communications that were previously concerned only with research outcomes. The archive documents an institution that did not choose authoritarianism as a founding principle. It arrived there through a series of individually reasonable decisions, each of which slightly reduced the space available for disagreement until the space was gone. The record of how it happened is preserved in full, accessible to anyone who reads the messages in the order they were sent. The synths the Institute eventually produced are the most technically sophisticated achievement that emerged from those 40 years. Generation 3 synths, the Institute's most advanced model, biologically constructed to be indistinguishable from human beings through visual examination, physical contact, or standard medical assessment, represent a technological achievement with no precedent in any record compiled from the Eastern Territories. Documentation from the Capital Wasteland, gathered approximately a decade before the Institute's current operations, describes the scientific community of that region, including the researchers at Rivet City, the most sophisticated civilian research installation in those ruins, without any reference to human identical synthetic biology. No rumor, no partial account, no second-hand description of anything approaching Generation 3 technology appears in those earlier records. The Institute's most significant product was apparently developed, refined, and deployed within a 10-year window without producing any external evidence of its development. A decade is not a period in which synthetic human biology is typically developed from a standing start. The technology arrived in the broader record fully formed, without a visible history of becoming what it became. The production floor where Generation 3 units are assembled is built with a level of anatomical specificity that the pace of most encounters within it does not reward. The assembly stages visible from the floor's observation positions show units at successive points in the construction process. Skeletal frameworks, partially developed musculature, incomplete surface coverage, each stage rendered with a unique model built specifically for this location and not reused anywhere else within the facility. The floor represents the most detailed biological documentation in the entire facility. It is also the section of the Institute that most people move through as quickly as possible during periods of conflict. The detail was built for an audience willing to stop in a space that most people sprint through. Most people sprint through it. The specificity of what is being made here, the precision of the process, the incremental stages of something being constructed to resemble a person, exists in full, available to anyone who pauses long enough to look. A faint mechanical hum passes through the floor panels at irregular intervals, originating from somewhere below. The residential quarters assigned to the Institute's permanent population contain the evidence of people who lived within these walls long enough to develop habits, preferences, and attachments that had nothing to do with their professional function. A child's drawing pinned to a bulletin board, a half-completed logic puzzle saved on a personal terminal, a small collection of pressed flowers arranged under a glass panel and mounted beside a desk. These objects were placed to establish that the people who chose to remain in the Institute, or who were born into it and never left, carried interior lives that the institution did not create and could not fully manage. In most encounters with the residential section, those objects are passed at speed, glimpsed in peripheral vision, while moving toward objectives that involve destruction rather than observation. The flowers are seen on the way to something burning. The evidence of humanity in the most controlled environment in the territory is encountered in the context of ending it. In the upper residential tier, a specific inconsistency is preserved in a bedroom belonging to the facility's director. Father, the individual who leads the institute, revealed through the facility's records to be a person named Sean, who was taken from Vault 111 as an infant, has a photograph on his bedroom wall showing a woman and a man in pre-war clothing, in a setting consistent with the decades before October 2077. The photograph's details, the era, the clothing, the visual quality, are inconsistent with any period of Sean's documented biography. He was born inside Vault 111 in 2077. He was removed from that vault as an infant. He has lived within this facility for the entirety of his life following that removal. No pre-war photograph of him exists. A photograph that presents itself as documenting a childhood he did not have, in a world he never inhabited, was placed in his room without being checked against the account of who he is. It was never corrected. The photograph remains on the wall of a person whose documented history makes it impossible. The parallel between the Institute's history and that of the Brotherhood of Steel was constructed deliberately. Both organizations trace their origins to small groups of technically skilled individuals who survived the war, gathered others around them, established internal hierarchies, and over time shifted their primary concern from their stated founding purpose toward the perpetuation of the institution itself. One descended from military personnel who believed technology should be preserved and controlled. The other descended from researchers who believed science should continue regardless of external conditions. Both arrived through different paths at the same destination, a closed system that treats its own continuation as a higher priority than the principles that justified its existence. The enemy in this territory is not one organization or the other. It is the process that both organizations underwent, the gradual narrowing of institutional purpose towards self-preservation, which proceeds the same way, regardless of whether the founders wore uniforms or laboratory coats. The silence in the Institute is not the silence of an empty space. The ambient audio architecture of this facility uses a technique in which the intervals between environmental sounds are filled with an extremely low volume antiphase signal, a sound engineered to partially cancel the natural acoustic properties of the space it occupies. The result is not quiet. Quiet is the absence of sound in a space that retains its natural acoustic character. What the Institute produces is a space that has had its acoustic character removed. The difference between these two conditions is difficult to describe verbally, but is registered by anyone who spends time in both. The facility does not simply lack noise. It has been processed to prevent the accumulation of noise. Sound in the Institute is managed the same way every other environmental variable is managed. The silence is maintained. It does not occur naturally. It is produced among the terminal entries accessible throughout the facility. A specific category of messages appears in multiple locations without connecting to any active process or documented outcome. These entries, attributed to researchers, questioning the ethical basis of specific ongoing procedures, requesting formal review processes, proposing alternative approaches to problems that current policy addressed through more aggressive means, were produced by a group referred to in internal archival files as the Grey Faction. This group represented an organized internal dissent movement that, in earlier versions of the facility's history, would have offered a path toward institutional reform rather than institutional destruction. Their messages are readable. Their proposed alternative outcomes are documented. The faction itself was removed from the facility's history before that history was finalized, but its written record was not removed with it. The dissenters exist only in their messages, which lead to nothing, connect to nothing, and resolve nothing. The Institute silenced the voices that questioned it, and then preserved the transcripts. The cafeteria on the facility's main residential level serves scheduled meals from a menu that includes fresh produce, prepared proteins, and beverages that do not come from pre-war storage. Somewhere below the sections accessible through standard movement through the facility, growing systems, protein synthesis infrastructure, and water processing units sustain a population that has never needed to forage, trade, or compete for food. These systems are referenced in terminal documentation, but never physically encountered by anyone moving through the Institute's mapped areas. The facility's full extent, what lies below the reactor level, below the production floor, below the lowest accessible corridor, is not represented in any navigable geometry. The clean white cafeteria is supplied by systems that cannot be reached. The Institute solved its own survival completely and then declined to show the solution. Whatever is beneath the lowest visible floor remains there, operating unobserved. The Institute had solved every problem it chose to solve, and had simply, quietly, chosen not to solve the ones that lived above them. Rising up through the layers of earth and old infrastructure that separate this facility from the surface, through the ruins of what was once a university campus, and then through the compressed streets of the old city moving east, a different kind of organization operated in the same territory. It did not have white walls or controlled silence, or a cafeteria with fresh produce. It had a crypt and a trail, and a name hidden inside its own password, and it spent its existence trying to undo what the white rooms below produced. The trail begins at a ring set into the pavement, a circular marker, painted red, embedded in the ground at the start of a route that runs through what remains of the old city's historic district. The route was, before the war, a tourist attraction, a walking path connecting 14 sites associated with the American Revolution, maintained by the city as a form of living historical documentation. The markers still exist in the ruins. The path between them can still be followed, and someone, at some point after the war ended and the city emptied, added something to the trail that was not part of its original design. The Freedom Trail was incorporated into the ruined map of this territory with a degree of accuracy unusual for a reconstructed environment. 14 documented stops from the real pre-war route were researched and positioned within the compressed geography of the old city at approximately correct relative distances. The sequence: Old South Meeting House, Park Street Church, Granary Burying Ground, continuing through the remaining landmarks, follows the actual historical order of the original trail. The distances were compressed to fit the navigable map, but the arrangement was preserved. A person familiar with the real route could follow this one and recognize the logic of its progression. The city's historical memory was used as a structural element. The memory was accurate enough to function as architecture. Broken brick and old mortar line the base of every building along the trail's northern section. What was added to the trail after the war came in the form of letters. Specific markers along the route were modified, subtly, in ways that required close examination to detect, to incorporate individual letters into their existing designs. Following the trail and collecting those letters in sequence produces a word. The word is railroad. The password to find the organization was the organization's own name, encoded into a trail it had adapted for its purposes, requiring only that a person follow the path far enough and pay enough attention to read what had been left for them, whether this was designed as a philosophical statement about the nature of hidden things, that secrets often announce themselves to anyone willing to look, or simply as an efficient puzzle that happened to carry additional meaning. The records do not specify. The railroad concealed itself inside its own identity and relied on the assumption that most people would not look carefully at what was directly in front of them. The path ends at a church, the Old North Church, a structure standing in this part of the city since the 18th century, associated in pre-war historical accounts with Paul Revere's signal lanterns and the beginning of the Midnight Ride, survived the war in structural form intact enough to be occupied. Below the main floor, in the crypt level, where the building's dead have been interred across several centuries, the railroad established its headquarters. The names on the stone markers in that crypt were not invented for the purpose of populating the space. They were taken from actual burial records connected to the real building. The names of real individuals interred in the real church that existed at this location before the war. The organization that dedicated itself to the liberation of synthetic people built its base among the documented names of people who had been real. The graves were already there. The railroad moved in among them. Stone walls hold the cold of the crypt at a constant temperature, regardless of the season above. Adjacent to those historical graves, the railroad maintains its own record of loss. A section of crypt wall has been covered in metal plaques, each bearing a name, a designation, and a brief epitaph. The names are not historical. They were written specifically to populate this wall. Fictional individuals who exist nowhere else in the facility's records, who have no physical presence, no voiced dialogue, no documented actions beyond what their epitaphs describe. Some epitaphs provide enough detail to suggest complete biographies. An agent described as the best at a specific skill, taken before that skill could be fully applied. Another described through a number, 12 successful operations, and a single statement about what those operations shared. The memorial wall contains the entire existence of characters who were created only to be mourned. They were built as absence rather than presence. Their only function in the record is to have been lost. Among the living members of the organization, one individual maintains a more complicated relationship with the concept of personal history. Deacon presents a different account of his past in nearly every conversation in which the subject arises. The inconsistencies are acknowledged openly. He confirms that he lies, that the lies are habitual, that the true account of who he was before the railroad is not something he offers. The design intention was permanent ambiguity, a character whose history could not be reconstructed because it was actively obscured by the person carrying it. However, the personnel files accessible on a terminal in the headquarters, available early in any encounter with the organization, before the character's deliberate unreliability has been fully established, contain an entry identifying his name, his original designation within the organization, and the year his association began. The mystery was designed to be unsolvable. The solution was placed in the administrative records. Anyone who checked the filing system before the character established his reputation for misdirection would find what the character spent considerable effort concealing. The organization's leader presents a different kind of opacity. Desdemona, The railroad's director, identifiable by her position within the hierarchy, rather than by any personal detail she volunteers, carries no documented past within any accessible record in the headquarters. Her full name does not appear. Her history before assuming leadership is not referenced. Her motivations beyond the organization's operational purpose are not articulated. This absence was constructed deliberately. An organization whose members operate under false names, performed identities, and carefully managed personal histories reaches its logical conclusion in a leader whose identity has been entirely subsumed by institutional function. Desdemona is whatever the railroad requires of someone in her position. Whatever she was before that requirement existed is not recorded anywhere within these walls. Cold air settles low near the crypt floor, moving in slow currents along the stone. The procedure the railroad uses to protect the synths it removes from Institute control involves replacing their existing memories with constructed identities. New personal histories, new names, new context for self-understanding that allow them to function in surface society without being identified as synthetic. This procedure, performed by Dr. Amari using equipment in the memory den, produces a person who does not know what they were. The existence of this technique appears in records from the Capital for Wasteland, compiled approximately a decade before the railroad's current operations, in connection with a search conducted by an Institute representative named Dr. Zimmer for a runaway synth carrying replaced memories. In those earlier records, the existence of a synth with modified memories is treated as an alarming novelty, something new and unsettling rather than a known possibility. The railroad has been performing the procedure systematically for years. Either the technique was established long before those earlier records suggest, or it was developed in the interval, and the development was not documented externally. Neither possibility is addressed in any connected account. Every safe house the railroad maintains across the territory is stocked according to a standardized supply list. The list includes medical supplies, currency reserves, and a box of sugar bombs, a pre-war breakfast cereal product with a 2-century shelf life, and a formulation that, in conditions of extended physical exertion and limited dietary variety, produces a marginal increase in radiation exposure alongside its caloric contribution. Every safe house contains the cereal. No document in the organization's records explains its inclusion in the standard kit. No character within the organization references it. The railroad equipped every emergency shelter it prepared for the people it was trying to protect with a product that is mildly harmful to the people who consume it. The inclusion appears to have been a logistical decision made at some point in the organization's history and never reviewed. The audio environment of the crypt carries something that most people never consciously detect. The ambient track recorded for the headquarters includes, on a loop of 90 seconds, a sound described in the documentation of its construction as a door closing somewhere above. The sound is below the threshold of conscious registration under normal listening conditions. Its presence in the audio track is confirmed by analysis of the recording's component layers. The crypt of the Old North Church has, in every account of the railroad's operations, a door closing somewhere above it at 90-second intervals. The door has no visible source. Its location within the building is not documented. No character references the sound. It closes every 90 seconds because it was placed in the audio track, and it has been closing every 90 seconds since the first moment anyone set foot in this headquarters. Whatever door it has been closing for a very long time. The deepest account of the railroad's history involves an origin that the organization's final records never tell. Archived audio files connected to the organization's earliest period contain a partial recording describing an operational network that predated the Institute's synthetic life program by approximately 30 years. In that recording, a member of an earlier iteration of the organization describes moving people, not synths, but human beings held in forced labor conditions, through a system of safe passages and hidden contacts. The network that would eventually dedicate itself to freeing synthetic people from the Institute began by freeing biological people from raider-controlled labor camps. The mission changed when the nature of what was being enslaved changed. The infrastructure, the methods, and the organizational memory carried forward. The railroad's final records contain no reference to this origin. The organization that saved synthetic life began by saving human life, and the account of how it started was not preserved in any version of its history that the organization itself maintained. The railroad moved in the dark and wrote nothing down that it didn't have to, and in that careful silence, it kept alive the idea that what had been made to serve could, if helped, choose something else. West across the harbor, where the ruins of the waterfront give way to open water, and the eastern sky carries the first light of whatever passes for morning. In this territory, a shadow moves. It crosses the horizon slowly, too large for anything that should be airborne, accompanied by the layered sound of multiple engines working in sustained coordination. It is heading toward the ruins of the old airport. It has been visible from the high points of the city for several days. Whatever it is, it did not arrive quietly, and it was not designed to. The shadow arrives before the sound does. It crosses the northwestern horizon at a specific hour, moving at the pace of something very large that is working hard to stay in the air. The engines are audible several minutes before the full shape becomes distinct. A layered mechanical sound, sustained and deep, the kind that registers in the chest before it resolves into anything identifiable by the ears. By the time the full silhouette is visible above the harbor, the scale of it has already made its point. The Prydwen, the Brotherhood of Steel's flagship airship, its hull marked with the organization's gear and soot emblem in paint that has been weathered by years of active operation, does not arrive as a surprise. It arrives as a statement. The timing of that arrival was constructed with specific intent. The moment at which the Prydwen crosses the horizon was designed to occur at a point in events when its visual impact would be greatest, when the territory had been established enough for the arrival of something this large to carry weight, and when the Brotherhood's significance to the developing situation was about to become impossible to ignore. The ship was play-tested repeatedly in terms of visibility, from which elevated positions across the territory it could be seen, at what distance its silhouette became recognizable, whether the audio cue that accompanied it registered as significant rather than ambient. The Brotherhood of Steel does not announce its presence through intermediaries or advanced communications. It announces itself through the physical fact of an aircraft carrier crossing the sky. The announcement was engineered to be impossible to miss from almost anywhere in the region. Salt air moves across the harbor in slow currents, carrying the smell of rust and open water. The construction of a vessel at this scale, assembled from salvaged pre-war materials over approximately a decade, represents an engineering achievement without precedent in any account of post-war organizational capability. Records compiled from the capital wasteland during the same approximate period describe the Brotherhood's chapter in that territory as an organization managing serious resource constraints, struggling to maintain existing equipment and relying on scavenged components for basic operational continuity. The vertibirds, the pre-war military aircraft that the Brotherhood operates, are described in those records as difficult to maintain and increasingly scarce. The capability required to construct an airship of the Prydwen's scale during the same decade in which a related chapter of the same organization was struggling to keep smaller aircraft functional represents a gap that no connecting account explains. The Prydwen exists. The documentation of how it became possible does not. The individual who commands it carries his own gap between documentation and reality. Elder Arthur Maxson, The Brotherhood's leader, elevated to his position at an age unusually young for the rank, presents through his formal communications a voice of absolute institutional conviction. His public addresses to the organization's personnel describe a coherent ideological framework, a clear hierarchy of priorities, and a certainty about the Brotherhood's mission and methods that leaves no visible room for doubt. His personal terminal entries, accessible on the command deck to anyone who examines the space carefully, describe something different. Sleeplessness, the accumulation of decisions made without adequate information, the difficulty of performing certainty in front of people who require it from someone in his position. The public record and the private record describe two people who share one face and one set of responsibilities. The private version was written knowing that most people would not look for it. It was placed there for the ones who did. The people who serve under Maxon are documented in a different kind of record. The barracks level of the Pridwin contains assigned bunks for every named member of the Brotherhood's crew. Each bunk has a storage container with personal contents. Photographs, correspondence, small objects brought from wherever the soldier had been before they were assigned to this vessel. One container belongs to a crew member who appears in no conversation, who has no documented function beyond occupying space in the background of the ship's operational life. Inside the container is a drawing made by a child, labeled in crayon with two words, for Dad. The soldier who received this drawing carries it on the most significant military asset in the territory. He will never speak about it to anyone. The drawing is not hidden. It is simply in a container that belongs to someone who has nothing important to say, and therefore is never opened by anyone looking for something important. It waits there, specific and legible, for the person who opens every container rather than only the significant ones. Beneath the Pridwin, the ruins of what was once Logan International Airport spread across the harbor's eastern edge. The commercial terminal building at the airport's center was preserved through the war in sufficient structural condition to retain its original interior signage. The departure board, the large display that listed flight destinations and gate assignments for the airport's last operating day, still holds its final entries. Cities are listed: Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles. The last scheduled departures from this terminal, never completed, recorded on a board that has displayed them unchanged for 2 centuries. Los Angeles, as documented in the earliest surviving records of the Western Territories, and in more recent accounts compiled from that region's ruins, was not a functioning city of the kind that a commercial flight would serve on the morning of October 23rd, 2077. A flight to Los Angeles was scheduled to depart from this airport on the day the bombs fell. The board does not know this. It simply displays what was scheduled, and what was scheduled never accounted for what was coming. The airport perimeter receives periodic pressure from the surrounding ruins in the form of organized attacks. Feral ghouls, individuals whose radiation exposure exceeded the threshold at which cognitive function could be maintained, leaving only the most basic behavioral drives intact, approach the airport boundary in escalating numbers over time, following a pattern designed to reflect the consequences of a large military installation operating in the middle of a populated ruin. The pattern continues, regardless of whether the installation is actually present in any given account of the territory's history. The attacks occur on schedule, even in circumstances where the Brotherhood never established a presence at the airport. The ghouls move toward a camp that does not exist, following a timetable built around an occupation that never happened in that particular version of events. The schedule was built around the installation. The schedule does not require the installation to function. Within the airport's operational area, the Brotherhood's supply structure reveals a practical tension with its stated ideology. The organization presents itself as separate from and superior to the civilian society of the surrounding wasteland. Its hierarchy is strict. its membership requirements exclusive, its sense of institutional identity defined in significant part by what distinguishes it from the people who live in the ruins outside its perimeter. Its quartermaster sells equipment to those same people for bottle caps. The currency accepted at the Brotherhood's supply point is the informal standard that emerged from the territory's civilian economy. A system the Brotherhood did not create and does not officially endorse. An organization whose foundational identity rests on separation from the wasteland has integrated its commercial operations fully into the wasteland's economic infrastructure. The ideology and the accounting are maintained by different people, apparently, and the two departments have not compared notes. The engineer responsible for the ship's mechanical systems maintains her workspace according to a different set of priorities. Proctor Ingram, head of the Pridewinds engineering division and the primary coordinator of the power armor program that defines the Brotherhood's ground combat capability, occupies a workspace on the engineering deck that contains no Brotherhood iconography of any kind. No emblem, no ceremonial object, no reference to the organization's history or stated values. The space holds tools, active work, ongoing projects, and the documentation of problems currently being solved. Every other significant space on the Pridewind carries visible markers of Brotherhood identity. The gear and sword symbol, the institutional colors, the weight of an organization that considers its own imagery important. Ingram's space carries none of it. She is the most operationally critical person on the vessel, responsible for keeping it in the air. Her workspace is a portrait of someone who considers the work more important than what the work is supposed to represent. The hull of the ship carries its own documentation. The paint applied to the Pridwind's exterior surfaces, its insignia, its unit designations, its hull numbering, incorporates weathering patterns consistent with 4 to 6 years of continuous airborne operation. Rain streaking runs in directions determined by the ship's standard heading and typical weather exposure. UV fading is concentrated on surfaces with the greatest direct light exposure during operational hours. Mechanical wear marks appear specifically at access panels, landing struts, and high-traffic exterior positions. The weathering is not random. It is positioned according to how a ship of this type, flying these routes, in these conditions, would actually age. The Pridwin was built as an object with a history already visible on its surface. A vessel that had been somewhere before it arrived here, carrying the evidence of that journey in the condition of its paint. The Pridwin cast its shadow over the airport, over the harbour, over the city's eastern edge, and in that shadow, the Brotherhood made its position clear. It had come not to join the wasteland, but to decide what the wasteland would become. Far to the west, past the boundary of any territory the Brotherhood had mapped or claimed, the ruins gave way to something that operated according to entirely different principles. Something louder, something older in its own commercial way, a place that had been built to manufacture a specific emotional experience, and was now manufacturing something else entirely, in the hands of people who had never been its intended audience. The mascots are still smiling. That is the first thing. Before the entrance archway comes into full view, before the scale of what was built here registers properly, the painted faces appear. Cartoon figures pressed into every available surface of outer structures, rendered in colors that were chosen to be visible from a distance, and to communicate a specific emotional state to anyone approaching. Joy, excitement, the particular brightness of a face that has been designed to make a person feel that something wonderful is about to happen. The faces have been there for 200 years. The paint has faded and cracked and been covered in places by other markings left by the people who occupy the park now. But the smiles remain beneath everything, printed into surfaces that proved more durable than the civilization that needed them to mean something. The Nuka Corporation produced those faces to sell a product. The product is gone, The company is gone. The consumers are gone. The smiles stayed. Nuka World was designed as a study of what commercial culture looks like when the commerce has been removed, and only the culture remains. The park's entire physical vocabulary, its signage, its architecture, its color palette, its mascots, its themed zones, its souvenir infrastructure, was built around a single brand identity. Every building references Nuka-Cola. Every pathway is named after a product or a product variant. Every decorative element was chosen to reinforce the emotional association between this place and the beverage it was built to celebrate. The result, 2 centuries after the last bottle was manufactured, is a landscape that functions as pure advertising. Every surface promoting something that no longer exists, to an audience that was never meant to be here, maintained by occupants who have no relationship to the product being advertised, and no interest in developing one. The raiders who control the park now have painted over some of the signage, modified some of the structures, marked certain areas with their own territorial designations. The Nuka-Cola branding absorbs all of it. The park's original identity is more saturated than anything applied on top of it. The corporate aesthetic outlasted every attempt to replace it. Warm, stale air moves through the park's interior in slow currents, pushed by ventilation systems, still drawing power from the pre-war grid. The product that the park was built to celebrate produced, in the years before the bombs fell, a more varied catalogue than most distribution networks carried. Nuka World holds the full range: regional variants, promotional formulas, limited edition configurations, and prototype versions that were never approved for general release. Among the prototype formulas documented in the park's internal records is Nuka Cola Dark, a variant described in its product development files as incorporating an alcohol component alongside the standard caffeinated formula. The resulting beverage was simultaneously a stimulant and a depressant, energizing and intoxicating, capable of producing contradictory physiological effects in the same consumer. The product documentation does not identify a target demographic for this formulation. The age group that the Nuka-Cola Corporation considered appropriate for a caffeinated alcoholic beverage sold under a family-friendly brand was not recorded. The formula exists. The intended consumer does not appear in the records. The people who were employed to maintain the park's presentation understood it differently than its visitors did. Break room terminals distributed throughout the park's backstage areas, the maintenance corridors, the staff lounges, the costume storage rooms that visitors were never meant to enter, contain a record of working conditions that contradicts everything the park's public-facing design communicated. Complaints about mandatory costume policies that required workers to remain in character through physical discomfort. Disputes over compensation that had been ongoing for months without resolution. Recurring objections to the quality of the meals served in staff areas compared to the food available in the park's public dining locations. An entry dated 6 months before the bombs fell describes a coordinated refusal by a group of workers to attend the park's mandatory monthly morale sessions. Events called Nuka Spirit Meetings, designed to reinforce employee enthusiasm for the brand. The workforce that maintained the performance of endless happiness was largely unhappy. The terminals that preserved their complaints were never accessible to park visitors. The smile on the surface and the record beneath it were always 2 separate things. Beyond the main thoroughfare, past a section of collapsed structure that has been partially cleared by the park's current occupants, the Safari Adventure Zone occupies a large open area designed to suggest an African savanna. Artificial rock formations, synthetic trees with textured bark and static leaves, animatronic animal figures positioned at intervals throughout the landscape, a giraffe at the waterhole, a group of zebras near the tree line, a lion surveying open ground from an elevated platform. All of the animatronics are non-functional. Their surface coverings have deteriorated in various degrees, depending on their exposure and position. What remains in each case is the internal armature, the metal skeleton that gave the figure its shape and maintained its pose. Fake animals in fixed positions, holding the shapes they were given, surrounded by a landscape that was constructed to look like somewhere else. Into this space, actual animals have moved. Rad scorpions navigate between the artificial zebras. Feral ghouls occupy the same sightlines as the non-functional lion. Real creatures, shaped by genuine radiation and genuine evolutionary pressure, move through a manufactured habitat that was designed for creatures that were never real. Nothing in the zone's original design prepared it for anything living. The living things arrived anyway and arranged themselves among the props. Adjacent to the Safari Adventure Zone, the Galactic Zone presents a different kind of preserved performance. The space-themed area contains a projection system mounted in a domed structure that still cycles through its original programming. An educational astronomy presentation designed to rotate through constellation maps, planetary information, and starfield imagery on a loop that has not been interrupted since the system was first activated. The dome plays accurate astronomical content to an empty auditorium. When certain electrical modifications installed by the park's current occupants are activated before the associated territorial disputes are resolved, the projection system enters a state in which its original content and the new overlays coexist in the same display. Accurate constellation data appears alongside symbols that have no relationship to astronomy. The scientifically correct sky is annotated with graffiti that the projection system was never designed to display. This overlap was identified as a minor technical issue and left unaddressed. The stars are still accurate beneath the tagging. The universe is still correctly mapped. It is simply no longer the only thing on the screen. The soundtrack playing through all of it has never changed. Nuka World's speaker system, running on the same pre-war power infrastructure that keeps the projection dome operational, broadcasts mid-century American popular music across every zone of the park. The selection was made for maximum tonal contrast. The most optimistic sonic register available, sustained without variation through every category of activity the park now hosts. The choice to maintain the cheerful soundtrack rather than allowing it to degrade as the park's character becomes increasingly violent was debated at length during the park's construction. The conclusion was that the music should continue. A raider camp and a family theme park share the same audio environment in Nuka World because the audio environment was designed for the latter, and the latter was replaced by the former without anyone stopping the music. The park never registered the change. The speaker system never learned that the audience it was performing for had been replaced by one with entirely different interests. The most dangerous animal in the park was also the most deliberately created. The gator claw, found exclusively within the Safari Adventure Zone, was produced through a pre-war genetic program that combined deathclaw biology with alligator DNA, with the stated purpose of creating an attraction unlike anything available at competing facilities. The resulting organism demonstrated swimming capability that the standard deathclaw, engineered primarily for terrestrial pursuit, does not possess. Gator claws transition between the zone's water features and the surrounding terrain without the navigation errors that affect deathclaws placed near water elsewhere in the territory. They hunt in shallow water and on open ground with equal effectiveness. The behavioral systems governing their aquatic movement were developed specifically for this creature and applied nowhere else. The park's designers built something to draw crowds. The thing they built has been developing its capabilities through successive generations for 2 centuries in a park that no longer has crowds. For reasons that have nothing to do with entertainment, the attraction became a predator, and the predator kept improving itself. The financial scale of what was built here creates a question that the broader commercial record of the pre-war world does not resolve in the Western Territories, in the ruins of Nevada, and the records associated with that region. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Company is described as Nuka Cola's most significant commercial competitor. The competition between the two brands is documented as economically meaningful, a genuine rivalry that affected market share and pricing decisions for both parties. Nuka World as a physical object represents a capital investment incompatible with a company operating in genuine competitive tension with a rival of comparable strength. The scale of the park, its square footage, its infrastructure, its themed zones, its multiple hotels and dining facilities and entertainment systems, implies a level of financial dominance that the documented rivalry with Sunset Sarsaparilla does not support. Either the competition was less significant than the Western records suggest, or Nuka Cola's financial position was substantially stronger than the existence of a serious rival implies. Or both sets of records are accurate, and the park simply should not exist at the scale it does. None of these possibilities are addressed in any document connected to either organization. Beneath the park's surface, the vault the Nuka Cola Corporation built here follows the same corporate logic as everything above it. The vault system operated by Vault-Tec, the pre-war corporation contracted by the federal government to construct and manage civilian shelter facilities, has, in multiple documented cases, been found to have served purposes shaped by agreements with private commercial interests, rather than purely by government specification. The facility beneath Nuka World was designated as a marketing research installation. Its residents studied for brand loyalty patterns and consumer behavioral responses over the duration of their isolation. A similar dynamic shaped Vault 114, a facility constructed beneath the old city to the east, which subjected its inhabitants to conditions designed to study class resentment and social hierarchy under pressure. Both vaults used their populations as research material for non-scientific corporate purposes. The bombs may have been delivered by governments, but the vaults were built inside arrangements between government contractors and private enterprise. The shelter network, across multiple documented examples, served the interests of corporations alongside the interests of the people it claimed to protect. At the entrance to the park, the archway bearing the Nuka Cola name and logo spans the arrival road at a scale that was built to impress rather than to function. Park records describe peak daily attendance of approximately 12,000 visitors. The physical width of the entrance archway's passable area, measured against the standard throughput calculations used for crowd management at large public events, produces a maximum hourly admission rate of approximately 400 people. At 12,000 visitors per day distributed across a standard operating window, the entrance structure would have required visitors to queue for approximately 30 hours before gaining admission. The most prominent architectural feature of the park, the structure every visitor passed beneath, the first thing seen from the approach road, the element that communicated the park's scale, and ambition before anything else, could not have processed the attendance the park claimed to receive. The ambition of the entrance was built at a size that the entrance function could not support. The image of the park was always larger than the park. Nuka World had promised the best day of your life, every day, forever. And it had delivered on that promise only for as long as the world it was designed for continued to exist. East of here, past the wide-open territory that separates the park from the coastline, the land eventually gives way to water. The water gives way to islands. And on one of those islands, the fog comes in low and does not leave. A permanent atmospheric condition generated by something buried beneath the island's interior, changing the light, changing the ecology, changing everything that has lived there long enough to be changed by it. A fishing town exists on that island's edge, facing outward toward the open Atlantic, having decided long ago that the fog was simply part of where it lived. The ferry crossing takes long enough to feel like leaving something behind. By the time the island's coastline becomes visible through the grey, the mainland has disappeared entirely in the other direction. What lies ahead is not a continuation of the territory that came before it. The architecture is different. Cedar shingles, boat sheds, dock pilings, the specific weathered quality of structures built to resist salt air and cold rain, rather than the brick and steel of the old city. The smells is different. Brine and wet wood, and something organic that drifts in from the water on the prevailing wind. And the light is different in the most fundamental way. It does not come cleanly from above. It filters through a layer of atmospheric material that sits low over the island at all times, diffusing every source into a general luminescence with no clear origin point. The fog is not weather. It does not arrive and depart. It is the island's permanent condition, produced by something at the island's center that has been running without interruption since before the settlement on the eastern shore was established. Far Harbour was constructed with the specific intention of feeling like a place that existed before anyone came to document it. The research that shaped its architecture drew from the actual material culture of Maine coastal fishing communities. The specific proportions of cedar shingle facades, the arrangement of boat storage relative to working docks, the relationship between a lobster boat's mooring position and the shed where its equipment was maintained. These are details that do not announce themselves. They are simply correct, in the way that things built by people who studied their subject, rather than approximating it from a distance, tend to be correct. A person who had spent time in real fishing towns along the North Atlantic coast before the war would recognize this settlement not as a reconstruction of any specific place, but as a faithful representation of a type of place, the kind of community that organizes itself around the sea and develops its own internal logic about how everything should be arranged. The specificity was the point. The team that built this settlement wanted the people who arrived here to feel that they had entered somewhere with a history that preceded their arrival. The island's history, however, is shaped less by its human inhabitants than by what the fog did to everything else. The radiation-charged atmospheric layer that covers the island was generated by a reactor installed at the Children of Atom settlement in the island's interior. The nucleus, a pre-war nuclear submarine docking facility repurposed as a religious compound. The fog has been present long enough to function as an ecological force, rather than a temporary condition. The island's trees grow in configurations that minimize their lower canopy exposure. Branching patterns optimized over generations of growth to keep foliage above the densest fog layer. Ground vegetation across the island shows radiation resistance not observed in equivalent plant species on the mainland. Several animal populations found only on the island display physical differences from their mainland counterparts. Skeletal proportions, surface coloration, behavioral patterns, consistent with multiple generations of adaptation to high ambient radiation. The island did not always look this way. The fog arrived, and the island's biology reorganized itself around the new conditions. And after enough time passed, the reorganized version became the only version anyone living here had ever known. The largest creature that reorganization produced is the fog crawler, resembling a vastly enlarged crustacean with a body plan that suggests multiple evolutionary pressures applied in rapid succession. The fog crawler navigates the island's terrain using a sensory system calibrated for low visibility conditions rather than open sight lines. In dense fog, which covers most of the island most of the time, the creature locates targets through sound and proximity rather than visual tracking. This behavior was built as a unique navigation mode, applied to this creature alone, in this location alone. Every other large predator in the Eastern Territories uses visual targeting as its primary detection system. The fog crawler uses the fog itself as its natural environment, hunting in the way something would hunt if it had never known a landscape without obscured sightlines. The creature was not found on the island. It was produced by the island, shaped by exactly the conditions that make it most dangerous. Above the fog, on elevated ground at the island's northeastern section, another kind of adaptation was in progress. Arcadia, a settlement constructed within a pre-war astronomical observatory, was established as a refuge for synths who had escaped the Institute and wished to live with full awareness of what they were. The observatory's physical position was selected deliberately, elevated above the primary fog layer, its main telescope pointed outward at the sky, its sightlines directed away from the island's surface rather than downward into it. The synths who built their community here chose a structure that looked outward and upward rather than inward or underground. The contrast with the Institute, which exists entirely below the surface, whose architecture is defined by enclosure and control, was embedded in the choice of location. The telescope in the observatory's main chamber points at the same sky as the one visible from every other elevated position in the territory. The difference is that the people who built this settlement chose a place from which that sky was the primary view. The oldest synth at Arcadia has a different relationship to the island than anyone else who lives on it. Dima, who arrived on the island before the settlement was established, before the fishing community reached its current form, before many of the current residents were born, distributed fragments of his earliest memories across physical storage devices hidden at various points around the island. The drives were placed in locations he had visited in the island's early period, and their contents reflect that period accurately. Small sensory observations, the quality of light at specific times, of day from specific positions, the sound of rain on a particular stretch of the eastern shore. These memories are not strategically significant. They are simply the accumulated residue of someone who stayed in a place long enough to notice its small details and find them worth preserving. The record of why Dima originally came to the island is not preserved in those drives. The record of why he stayed is, not in any single entry, but in the accumulation of small things that a person only notices when they are not thinking about leaving. What Dima chose to hide is more consequential than what he chose to remember. His capacity for self-directed memory modification, demonstrated in the events surrounding the island's central conflict, represents a capability that the broader record of Generation 3 synth design does not account for. The memory alteration process, as described in the main territory, requires external equipment and an operator working from outside the subject's neural architecture. Dima performed an equivalent operation on his own memories, selecting specific information for concealment and implementing that concealment without external assistance. Either Dima was produced with capabilities that deviate significantly from the standard Generation 3 design, or the memory modification technology has properties that the main territory's documentation does not describe. The inconsistencies was never resolved in any connected record. Dima's capabilities exceeded what his origin should have permitted, and no explanation for the excess was provided. The organization occupying the submarine facility at the island's center generated the fog as a byproduct of their reactor operations, and treat that generation as a form of divine expression. The children of Atom, whose earlier documented presence in the eastern wasteland consisted of a small group gathering around an undetonated nuclear device in a settlement called Megaton, maintain a fully armed and organizationally sophisticated chapter at the nucleus. The reactor that produces the fog is central to their theology. In certain accounts of the island's conflicts, that reactor is disabled. The theological significance of the fog is thereby removed. The fog, however, does not clear. The atmospheric layer that covers the island is implemented as a fixed environmental condition, present regardless of the reactor's operational state, in any version of events where its removal was not made the explicit focus of a concluded process. The island that should be fog-free in those accounts remains fog-covered. The narrative possibility of a clear sky was incorporated after the visual system that produced the fog was already locked in place. The fog outlasted the source that was supposed to create it. The sound of the island begins before the visual documentation of it. The ambient audio recorded for the island was captured on location along the actual main coastline. The specific wave patterns of the North Atlantic in cold weather, the wind quality off open water, the particular calls of maritime birds in that specific geographic and climatic context. These recordings were then layered with radiation surge audio elements to produce the island's distinctive sound environment. Every sound on the island, every foghorn, every fog crawler vocalization, every atmospheric crackle sits on top of a foundation of real coastal sound. Underneath the radiation and the mutation and the 2 centuries of accumulated change, the island sounds like the coast it was built from. The real main shoreline is audible beneath everything that was added to it. The documentation of a real place is preserved inside the sound of a fictional one. At the island's working dock, the equipment used by the settlement's fishermen represents a different kind of accuracy. The lobster traps, nets, floats, mooring hardware, and boat fittings stored and deployed from the far harbour dock were built from individual models created for this location. None of them recycled from assets used elsewhere in the territory. Each lobster trap was constructed with accurate internal geometry. A rectangular wireframe, conical funnel entries designed to allow entry and prevent exit, ballast weighting appropriate for the water depth of the surrounding fishing grounds. The trap designs are correct. They reflect genuine knowledge of how lobstering equipment was constructed before the war and how it functioned in practice. The crabs those traps catch have been shaped by 2 centuries of radiation into forms that no pre-war trap was designed to contain. The tools are accurate. The world they operate in has moved beyond what the tools were built for. The regional beverage that the island produces to distinguish itself from mainland commercial culture carries its own specific absurdity. Vim, manufactured before the war by a local company as an alternative to the dominant national brands, remains available in multiple formulations throughout the island's territory. One variant, Vim Captain's Blend, is documented as incorporating sea kelp extract into its formula. The physiological effect attributed to this formulation is enhanced physical coordination and reaction speed. The pre-war beverage industry of the Maine coast identified locally harvested seaweed as a viable performance enhancement compound, incorporated it into a bottled drink, and produced a product that still delivers its documented effect 2 centuries after the manufacturing facility closed. The kelp is in the bottle. The bottle improves reflexes. No mechanism is described in any product documentation that would account for this outcome. The result is simply stated as fact, as though the connection between marine vegetation and enhanced human coordination required no further explanation than the label provided. The island had been changed by the fog, and the people on it had been changed by the island. And whatever they had been before the fog came was still there somewhere, in the structures they built, and the habits they kept, waiting to be recognized. Back across the water, through the territory that connects the island to the mainland, and the mainland to the old city, and the old city to the northwestern suburbs, one location remains that has been present since the first moment of this account. A concrete door on a hillside, a sealed facility beneath it, the place where everything in the territory began. Not metaphorically, but physically. In the literal sense that the person whose movements shaped the events of these ruins emerged from that specific vault on that specific hill and walked into a world that had been waiting 200 years for someone to walk through it. The hill looks different from the bottom, coming up from below, through the utility tunnels, through the sections of the vault that the opening sequence moved through too quickly for anything to register as evidence. The angle of approach reverses. The first time this place was seen, the view moved downward, from the surface through the blast door into the facility. This time the movement is upward, from the deeper sections toward the cryo chamber. And the things that look like infrastructure on the way down look like something else on the way back up. The walls carry their teal-green panels in the same arrangement. The fluorescent lighting runs the same amber emergency frequency along the floor's edge. The air holds the same sealed cold, the recycled stillness of a space that has maintained its internal climate for 2 centuries, without any consideration of the people it was maintaining that climate around. The vault looks the same. The understanding of what it is has changed entirely. Vault 111 is the only facility of its kind in the Eastern Territory that was designed to be read twice. The first reading was constructed to be incomplete. Environmental details distributed throughout the opening sequence. The arrangement of the cryopods. The positioning of the staff areas relative to the residential level. The specific language used on the signage were placed to function as backstory when seen from one direction and as evidence when seen from another. The cryopods in the main chamber appear, on first encounter, as the infrastructure of a shelter program. Rows of sealed units maintaining their occupants in suspended biological stasis, while the surface became survivable again. Encountered from the other direction, with the full record of what Vault-Tec intended for this facility in hand. The same pods read as containment. The difference between a shelter and a holding cell is not visible in the object itself. It is visible only in the purpose the object was built to serve. And the purpose was not written on the surface. Cold air moves through the cryo chamber in slow, recycled currents, carrying the dry mineral quality of air that has not been exchanged with the outside atmosphere in a very long time. Among the pods in the main chamber, one carries damage that was not documented in the official record of events within this vault. The pod belonging to the person who died here, the individual whose removal from cryogenic suspension by an outside party initiated the chain of events that define the territory's recent history, shows ice crystal distribution inconsistent with standard release procedures. The crystals are concentrated asymmetrically, heavier on one side than the other, in a pattern consistent with the pod having been opened from the exterior, using override access, rather than through its internal release sequence. The control panel on the same pod carries physical damage at the manual override interface specifically, the kind of wear produced by forceful operation rather than standard procedure. None of the recorded accounts of the events that occurred here show this damage being caused. The violence that produced it was not depicted. It was built into the object as a record of something that happened in the space between what was shown and what was real. The damage is there. The event that caused it exists only in what the damage implies. The other pods in the chamber carry their own kind of evidence. The overseer responsible for Vault 111's operation left a terminal record that describes a man managing systems he did not fully understand for purposes he was never told. His entries cover the early period of the Vault's operation, the weeks following the sealing of the blast door, the adjustment of the cryo systems to long-term maintenance protocols, the gradual recognition that the procedures he had been trained to follow did not match any of the operational scenarios he had been told to prepare for. Vault-Tec's actual experimental purpose for this facility, using its resident population as subjects for a long-term study of indefinite cryogenic suspension, was not communicated to the individual responsible for running the experiment. He managed the Vault systems in good faith, following instructions that made partial sense, never receiving the context that would have allowed the full picture to resolve. He died in the utility section, in sight of a security camera connected to the main terminal network, and no footage of that death was ever recorded on any terminal in the facility. Either the camera was not functional, or the recording was removed, or the skeleton was positioned without reference to what it faced. The overseer's final moments occurred in front of a recording device that produced no record. The experimental design itself carries an inconsistency that the Vault's own documentation does not acknowledge. Internal records describe the cryogenic suspension program as an unprecedented application of the technology within the Vault-Tec experimental network, a novel protocol distinct from anything being conducted at comparable facilities. Accounts compiled from the Western Territories, specifically from a location called Shady Sands and the vault system beneath it, describe a program called Buds, a Vault-Tec initiative that preserved selected corporate executives in cryogenic suspension for deployment after the war ended. That program operated out of Vault 31, a facility that maintained its frozen population on the same indefinite timeline as Vault 111's experiment. The technology described as unprecedented in the Northeastern records was simultaneously in active operation in the West. Whether Vault 111 represented the research phase of a program whose implementation occurred at Vault 31, or whether the two programs were developed independently without either division being informed of the other's work, no connected source has specified. The unprecedented experiment had a parallel that the experiment's own documentation did not mention. Pale light from the cryochamber's ceiling panels settles across the sealed pods in long, even bands that have not shifted in 2 centuries. The residents still inside those pods went into Vault 111 on the morning of October 23rd, 2077. They have not come out. The opening account of this Vault's history established that Vault-Tec's experiment required maintaining the resident population in suspension indefinitely, not as a temporary measure pending surface recovery, but as the permanent state the experiment was designed to produce and document. No record directs any attention toward releasing them. No account of the territory's events assigns any significance to their continued presence in the chamber. The story that moves through this territory begins with one person walking out of the vault and does not return to the people left behind. They remain in their pods at the conclusion of every documented version of events. They entered the vault on the same morning as everyone else. They are still there. The sound of that continued presence is built from recordings that share their origin with something more ordinary. The ambient audio of the cryochamber, the persistent low hum that accompanies the pod system's continued operation, was assembled from several layered sources during the facility's audio construction phase. One of those sources was a recording made inside a commercial refrigeration unit. A walk-in freezer documented during the research period of audio production. The frequency characteristics of large-scale food preservation equipment, it turns out, are sufficiently similar to those of human cryogenic suspension systems that a recording of one can be used to construct the sound of the other. The cryochamber sounds the way it does, partly because someone stood inside a refrigerator with a microphone. The room where people are preserved at temperatures incompatible with biological activity shares its acoustic signature in the sound design of this territory, with the room where vegetables are kept cold overnight. Both sounds serve the same basic function in the recording. Both are concerned, at their core, with the problem of keeping things from changing. What the chamber was built to keep from changing is visible in its color. Vault 111's interior surfaces use a palette that appears in no other vault documented across the Eastern Territory. The structural panels carry a desaturated teal green. The floors are a deep charcoal. Every comparable facility uses the Vault-Tec standard color language. Yellow for functional areas, blue-gray for utility sections. A palette designed to be recognizable, institutional, associated with the corporation's identity across its entire product line. Vault 111 was given different colors. The teal green was selected to reinforce, through visual association, the atmospheric qualities that define the facility: the cold, the stillness, the quality of something preserved in a medium that resists ordinary decay, the color of ice in deep water, the color of something that has been kept at a temperature where nothing moves. The visual decision means that this vault has never looked like the others. It has always looked like somewhere things were stored, rather than somewhere people were supposed to live. What was stored here, and what was lost in the same moment, began 4 minutes before the blast door closed. The pre-war morning in the neighborhood above this facility was constructed with a specific, deliberate purpose: to build the maximum possible attachment to a life before that life was taken away. A child in a crib, a spouse at a terminal, a dog at the front door, a radio program playing through a morning that felt, in every particular, like any other morning. Every element of those 4 minutes was selected through a process of determining what was universally recognizable as home. What combination of domestic detail would produce, in the widest possible range of people encountering it, the sense of something worth losing. The vault entrance was always visible on the hill from the neighborhood's edge. The morning was always going to end with a run toward it. The question that occupied the people who built those 4 minutes was not what would come after the morning. It was what the morning needed to contain so that its loss would mean something. The Pip-Boy 3000 Mark IV, the Robco Industries wrist-mounted personal information device assigned to the individual who walked out of this vault and into the territory above, carries a listed weight of 0 in every inventory system connected to its use. The device contains a functional map covering the full geographic range of the Eastern Territory, a radio receiver capable of accessing all active broadcast signals in range, a lighting system, a medical monitoring interface, and an organizational system managing the full weight of everything else carried. It weighs nothing. Every weapon acquired in the territory has a weight assigned to it. Every piece of protective equipment has a weight. The object that manages the inventory of everything else, worn on the wrist, contributing its own mass to the total load, was assigned a weight of 0, because assigning it an accurate weight would have created a small ongoing inconvenience. The most essential object in the territory does not, by the logic of the system that tracks all other weights, exist. The vault was the beginning, and, in its own way, it was also the end. The place the story came from, and the place that waited, sealed and cold, for whoever might come back to read what it had contained. There was no further distance to cover after this. The journey had moved from the neighborhood above to the museum to the south, through the walled city and the darker settlement beside it, through the factory and the campus and the irradiated southwestern crater, through a working vault and a controlled white facility, and a crypt and an airship and a commercial ruin and a fog-covered island. And it had ended here, where it began, in the room where everything that followed was stored before it was released. The question that remained was not geographic. It was the question that all of those places, held together, had been building toward from the beginning. There is no specific place left to enter. The journey has covered its geography. The neighborhood on the hill, the museum in the town, the walled city built inside a stadium, the settlement where outcasts gathered and wrote their principles on walls, the factory frozen, mid-production, the research campus reaching towards something it never reached, the irradiated crater where the bomb actually landed, the vault that learned to take care of itself, the white facility that controlled everything it touched, the crypt where a hidden organization preserved its dead, the airship casting its institutional shadow over the harbor, the commercial ruin still smiling through, the wreckage of everything that was supposed to make it meaningful, the fog-covered island that the fog had changed, and the cryochamber at the beginning and the end of a single long story. All of those places have been walked through. What remains is not another location. What remains is the question that all of those locations, taken together, were building toward without ever arriving at an answer. The question is about what survives and why. Fallout 4's full record, its accessible content, its removed content, its abandoned quest lines, and cut character arcs and scrapped faction outcomes, contains significantly more material than was ever made available through normal engagement with the territory. The estimated total of removed content, reconstructed through analysis of the data underlying the territory's accessible areas, exceeds the complete content of several smaller territories in the broader record. Entire narrative branches were constructed, populated with voiced characters and written outcomes, and then removed before the territory was finalized. Locations were built to a level of completion that suggests they were intended as major destinations, and then sealed or emptied when the purposes they were built to serve were cut from the final account. The territory that exists is a fraction of the territory that was imagined. What was made available is a selection from a much larger body of work. The selection was made, the rest was archived, and the archive has been quietly documented by those who went looking for what was taken away. Thin silence moves through these final moments, the way fog moves through low ground. Slowly, without urgency, filling the spaces between things. Throughout the accessible territory, personal marks were embedded in locations where they were unlikely to be found without deliberate searching. Names placed in terminal entries without any connected narrative purpose. Dedications written into the titles of books that most people never open. Call signs assigned to radio signals that most people never tune to. These marks were placed by the people who built the territory, in full knowledge that most people who moved through the spaces they had constructed would never encounter them. The act of placing something where it will probably not be found is a particular kind of statement about the relationship between making and being seen. It suggests that the making was sufficient in itself, that the record of having built something, hidden in the thing that was built, carries meaning independent of whether anyone ever uncovers it. Every hidden mark in the territory was placed by someone who hoped it would eventually be found, and who proceeded with the placing regardless of whether the finding was likely. The people who placed those marks also placed the dead, every skeleton visible across the full territory, in every building, along every road, in every collapsed domestic space, and every sealed institutional corridor, was positioned by hand. The process of determining how each one fell, which direction it faced, what it was doing at the moment it stopped, was carried out individually for every instance across the entire geographic range, including the outlying territories of the park and the island and the other distant locations. Several thousand individual decisions about how specific people ended, each one a small authored moment with no accompanying text, no explanation, no contextual marker to direct attention toward it, just a posture and a position, and the quiet implication that the person who chose this arrangement thought it was the arrangement that felt true. The ones sitting against walls waiting for doors that did not open. The ones face down on staircases. The ones curled in corners of rooms that were clearly not where they had intended to end up. Each posture was selected. Each selection was a story told entirely through physical position, requiring no words, surviving as long as the geometry that holds it together survives. What those positions tell, collectively, is the story of a world that ended mid-action. Every Fallout territory, from the earliest surviving accounts, set in the ruins of California and Nevada, through the records of the Capital Wasteland and the Mojave Desert and the forested mountains of Appalachia and the coastal ruins of the Northeast, through the most recent accounts compiled from the destroyed Western City and the settlements that formed in its aftermath, maintains a consistent relationship with the world that ended. The objects, the architecture, the commercial language, the music playing through broken speakers, The advertisements on collapsed billboards, the product names on containers that have been sitting on shelves for longer than most current residents have been alive. All of it connects back to something that existed and functioned before October 23rd, 1977. The wasteland does not invent its past. It preserves a version of it. The version is selective and compressed and shaped by the particular nostalgic register of mid-century American commercial culture. But the thing being preserved had a real referent. The ruins are built from memory. The memory was of something that was real, and the realness of the original thing is what gives the ruins their weight. The weight is audible, if the conditions are right. The concluding sound in the full account of Vault 111's story. The tone that plays across the final documentation of events, regardless of which path through the territory's conflicts was taken, was recorded at a frequency that corresponds to the ambient hum of the cryochamber in the vault at the beginning of the same story. The sound that accompanies the end of the account matches, in its fundamental frequency, the sound that was present before the account began. Whether this correspondence was designed as a deliberate structural element, a sonic circularity built into the account's architecture to suggest that the end is a form of return, or emerged as an accidental resonance between two recordings made at different points in the account's production, and never noticed until it was too late to change, was never confirmed in any connected documentation. The beginning and the end share a frequency. The cryochamber hum and the closing tone are, at the level of their recorded waveforms, the same sound. The vault at the start and the vault at the finish, separated by the full distance of everything in between, produce the same note. Now the journey settles. The landmarks release their grip one by one. The grass at Sanctuary Hills grows through the cracked sidewalks in the same patient way it has grown for 2 centuries, without instruction, without purpose beyond the fact of growing. The Museum of Freedom in Concord holds its name above the entrance in stone that nuclear fire could not remove. Its exhibits still carrying text that describes battles fought 300 years before the bombs fell. Diamond City sits inside the compressed bones of a stadium and calls itself a city, and has been doing so long enough that the claim has become true simply through repetition. Good Neighborhood runs its business in the dark and charges what the market will bear, and asks fewer questions than anywhere else in the territory, which is either a virtue or a warning depending on what a person needs from a settlement. The Corvega plant stands with its unfinished cars still hanging in their track mounts, waiting for components that have been delayed for 200 years. Arkjet Systems reaches toward a sky it never touched, its engine still functional in its bay, its basement still empty, where humanity's most ambitious plan once had a designated space. The glowing sea holds its green light over ground that was struck directly, and has been finding its own kind of order in the aftermath ever since. Vault 81 serves its scheduled meals and teaches its children and keeps its door open, which is the most radical thing any vault in the territory has managed to do. The Institute maintains its white corridors in enforced cleanliness, its silence managed rather than natural, its cafeteria serving meals from sources that remain, like so much else in that facility, unexamined. The Old North Church holds its crypt cold and its memorial wall steady, a door closing somewhere above it every 90 seconds for as long as the soundtrack runs. The Pridwen casts its operational shadow over the harbour, and the shadow has the weathering of years on its surface, every scuff positioned in relation to wind direction and mechanical use. Nuka World smiles through 2 centuries of everything that has been done to it, the mascots still visible beneath the layered marks of subsequent occupation, the speaker system still playing its optimistic soundtrack over whatever is currently happening on the park floor. The island sits in its permanent fog, the sound of the real Maine coast, audible underneath every modified sound the radiation has added. The lobster traps on the dock, accurate in their geometry, even when the things they catch no longer correspond to any pre-war species classification. And Vault 111 at the top of the hill, its cryo-green walls holding the same cold they have held since October 23rd, 1977, its pods sealed, its residents still inside. The territory did not become what it became because anyone designed it that way. It became what it became through accumulation, through every cereal bowl left on a counter, and every birthday cake never eaten, and every performance review filed 6 days before there was no longer anyone to act on it, and every skeleton posed in a position someone chose, because it felt like the right way for that particular person to have ended. Through every wall texture applied once and distributed everywhere, and every piece of music licensed from an archive and converted to mono to match the quality of a 2-century-old broadcast tower, and every door in an audio track, closing every 90 seconds in a crypt where an organization moved quietly and wrote as little as possible down. Through every cut character whose dialogue files still exist in the underlying data, still attached to a name that no longer appears anywhere in the accessible record. Through every sealed door leading to 40 square meters of empty rendered space that was once the beginning of something larger. Survival, across the full record of this territory, is not a quality that was planned into the things that survived. It is what happened to the things that were solid enough to remain after the conditions that built them changed into conditions that could no longer support them. The grass survived because grass survives. The stone survived because stone survives. The sound survived because someone made a recording, and the recording was used. And the frequency of that recording matches the frequency of another recording, made at a different point for a different purpose, and the matching was either intentional or accidental, and either way the note is the same. The pods are still there. The hum of their systems moves through the cryo chamber at its established frequency, the same frequency it has maintained since before the blast door opened for the first and only time and someone walked out and into the territory above. The frost on the sealed units has not changed. The residents inside have not changed. Whatever was preserved in those pods on the morning of October 23rd, 1977, is still preserved, not maintained, not attended to, simply never opened. There is a difference in this territory between things that survived because someone kept them and things that survived because nothing came to end them. The pods belong to the second category. They are still sealed. They are still cold. The program that keeps them cold is still running, doing what it was built to do, in a vault that has been sitting under a hill in the ruins of a Massachusetts suburb for 200 years, waiting for nothing in particular. The ruins still stand, and in the standing they keep what they keep, not by choice, not by design, not because anyone decided that these specific things deserved to last, simply because they were built solidly enough, and the conditions that would have ended them never quite arrived, and the world moved on without them, and they remained. The territory grows quiet now. The hum continues. The frost holds.